Simon & Schuster Audio presents Reba, My Story by Reba McEntire with Tom Carter. Read by Reba McEntire.
I was on a plane headed for our show in Atlantic City, New Jersey, when my husband and manager Narvel Blackstock showed me an issue of the supermarket tabloid, The Star. Now, Reba, try not to get upset, he told me, but I could see that he was pretty upset himself. Usually we laugh off such gossip mill stories, but this time the press had gone too far. A photo of me from an awards ceremony was plastered all over the Star's front page, and over it was printed an enormous headline. Shocking charge by 2 ex-wives. Reba stole our husbands. Inside were unkind interviews with Lisa Gilbert, Narvel's first wife, who has long ago remarried, since her divorce from Narvel 6 years ago, and Sherry, the former Mrs. Charlie Battles, who's been holding a grudge even longer, for a full 18 years since 1975. Why these women decided to speak out now was beyond me, and what they were quoted as saying was a hurtful exaggeration of the truth. But the truth doesn't sell newspapers, I guess. And when you're a public figure, everything you do is fair game for what I might call reinterpretation, if I was trying to be polite. That's one of the reasons that I'm speaking out, to set the record straight about my marriages and other matters that have been reported inaccurately by the press. But I have some other, more compelling reasons too. The first is that I'm lucky to have had a remarkable journey through life, and have met some wonderful people along the way, some of them in my own family. My grandpap, John Wesley McIntyre, and my daddy, Clark McIntyre, are famous for their rodeo triumphs. I was raised on a ranch which Mom and Daddy built from 40 acres at the time I was born to some 17,000 acres today, with us kids working alongside them tending the cattle just as cowboys had done for the last 100 years. Also, I want my son Shelby to understand what the traditional McIntyre cowboy life was like. My second reason is that I've had a marvelous time in the country music business and have been blessed with a thrilling degree of success. I'd like to give credit where credit is due. I could never have done it alone. Thirdly, I've had to face a terrible tragedy, and I've found that people want to know what it has taught me. Those questions haven't been easy ones to address, but I'd like to try. If there's anything I've learned, it's that there's no greater source of happiness than my family. I continue to get so much from them, emotionally and spiritually. For Christmas back in 1979, when I was making my first tentative inroads into the music business, my sister Alice gave me, of all things, a toilet seat cover. On it was monogrammed the words, "The Twinkle." She promised that if I ever made it big, she'd give me another one labeled The Star. I still haven't received it yet. That's my reminder that I haven't yet reached the top, that there's still so much for me to strive for and to achieve. Alice's gift, or lack of one, I guess you could say, shows me that at nearly 40, I have so much more to work for in life, so much more to look forward to. I sure can't think of a better gift than that. My daddy, Clark Vincent McIntyre, is a former 3-time world champion tie-down steer roper. He began roping when he was a small boy and entered his first amateur roping contest when he was 12 in 1939. At Pendleton, Oregon, Daddy turned professional when he won the Pendleton Roundup All-Around Cowboy Trophy at 17 years old. And by 1957, the biggest year he ever had, he earned $5,184. I once asked if winning the championship was as good as getting there. He said no. The fun to me was seeing if I could beat him and win the money. After I won, it was like, so what? I'm a lot like my daddy. The McIntyre clan built a legacy in the commercial rodeo world, but that story came a generation after my eccentric great-grandfather, Clark Stephen McIntyre. He was born on a Mississippi riverboat on September the 10th, 1855. Everyone in my family simply called him Pap. His family lived in Cairo, the southernmost city in Illinois. Pap had broken his back while riding a bicycle and carried a tremendous hump between his shoulders. Pap was married twice, fathered 12 children, and had numerous girlfriends, or so said Ray Williams, Daddy's cousin, who lived with Pap until he was 10. Ray tells a story about Pap traveling with his first wife and their 2 boys when one of the boys became ill. He decided the youngster needed chicken soup for medicine just about the time the group passed a house with a flock of chickens. Pap jumped from his wagon to chase a chicken, whose squawking alerted its owner. The owner ran outside and demanded to know what was going on. "We've got a sick child," Pap said. "Please help us catch one of our chickens that got loose." Well, the chicken's rightful owner chased it down and turned it over to Pap, not knowing he'd surrendered part of his own flock. The child eventually died, as did his brother. Within a month after burying the 2 boys, Pap buried his wife, the boy's mother, then went on with his life. At one point in his second marriage, he moved out of the house he lived in, with his wife and children, into a shanty filled with dogs, rats, snakes, chickens, bugs, and more. He called that dwelling his Dutch oven. He never washed his clothes or himself, and at night he'd put his coat on the back of a chair and a chicken or 2 would roost on it. The garment would be covered with droppings the next morning, but he would never wipe them off. He just put it on and let the droppings fall off throughout the day and in time to be replaced that night. He was one tough old bird. I'm told that people used to say it would kill a human being to live in that Dutch oven. I don't know if it killed Pap, but that's where he died, at the age of 79. It was Helen, Pap's second wife, who gave birth to John Wesley McIntyre, my grandfather, who became our family's first rodeo star. In 1930, John Wesley McIntyre, who us kids called Grandpap, and his wife Alice Kate Hayhurst McIntyre, traveled from Cairo to Limestone Gap, Oklahoma, where Grandma Alice got a job teaching school. When my father was born, he weighed over 10 pounds, and my grandmother had a terrible time delivering him. Due to the primitive techniques in those days, she never fully recovered and suffered from female problems for the rest of her life. Even though both families were friends, my family told me how Grandma Alice's folks thought Grandpap was irresponsible 'cause he wouldn't work the fields and cared little about anything that didn't involve riding and roping. Grandpap made so little money during the early years of their marriage, they might have starved to death if Grandma Alice hadn't been a school teacher. But Grandma was conservative with her money and saved, and they got by. And in time, Grandpap became a rodeo hero. In 1934, he took first place in the steer roping at Cheyenne, Wyoming, the indisputable championship rodeo of the world. In later years, Grandpap was a constant presence on our ranch, and us kids got very attached to him. My other grandfather, George Elvin Smith, was an orphan. Maybe that's why he was very sincere about taking care of his family. Even during the Depression, he made sure there was plenty of food on the table to eat and blankets on the bed. I was very close to his wife, my mama's mother, Reba Estelle Brassfield, and I'm her namesake, of course, and I truly adored her. She had Indian-like features with thick black hair that with time would streak with gray. She braided her hair every night, and it was almost like a ceremony to a little girl. I also remember how, in the evening, we'd sit on the front porch facing the west. Grandma would have her gallon jar filled with fresh milk heavy with cream, which she'd churn until it was butter. The lightning bugs would flash on and off as the light faded and the moon came up. The butter would taste great on our biscuits the next morning, or in the following night's blackberry cobbler, the best I ever had. You can be sure she picked the berries herself. Grandma was also the person who introduced me to Jesus Christ. Some of my fondest childhood memories have to do with Grandma telling me Bible stories when she and I fished from the pond dam. Grandma understood so well and taught me that the connection to God is deeper than simple words. I was baptized by immersion at the Baptist Church in Kiowa, Oklahoma, when I was 12 years old. Some folks don't think baptism is necessary, but Jesus thought so, and so do I. Though I don't go to church much now, I pray every day. God is 100% of my life. People can leave Jesus, but He'll never leave them. He has been with me all these years through trials and tribulations. There was a time or two when I might have been seriously injured or even killed had it not been for Him. And there have been times when I would have gone insane. if I hadn't had him to turn to. The best thing that ever happened to my daddy was my mama. They've known each other since they were young, and Mama can't recall when she first saw Daddy. He was just a little old fat kid who was always running around, she says. But she does remember in the 9th grade when he quit school forever. I think he got intimidated by high school because he had been sick in 1st grade and missed learning how to read. But what he lacks in reading, he makes up for by a natural gift for figures. Somehow they got together, but they'd forgotten their first date. They started going to church services or picture shows. Mama couldn't get enough of Clark Gable, Barbara Stanwyck, and many other movie stars of the 1940s. And I hated picture shows, Daddy says. I had to sit through them just to see her. Still, their courtship lasted for 5 or 6 years, depending on which parent you ask. After a while, Mama was looking for a marriage proposal, and finally she took matters into her own hands. I asked him, she said. They married on March 17th, 1950, when he was 22 and she was 23. Mama bought her own wedding ring for $27. Daddy put it on her finger, and for 44 years it has never been removed. They made their home just down the road from Grandpap and Grandma Alice. It was a 2-room shack with a wooden floor but no running water or electricity. Mama kept teaching school while Daddy pursued his rodeoing. Then Daddy won a car for winning a roping, and he told Mama to ask her brother Dale if he'd be willing to swap the car for his 80 acres down on Boggy Creek. Uncle Dale said yes, and it was a done deal. Mama stopped teaching after my oldest sister Alice was born in 1951. She was named Alice after Grandma Alice, who died in 1950. 2 years later, when my brother Pake was born, Daddy had to leave to go rodeoing. It was a hard time for Mama. Daddy left right after bringing Mama home from the hospital with a newborn baby. He got back home a few months later, and just as soon as he got into the house, he wanted to know where Pake was. "He's on the couch," Mama said. "You walked right past him." "That's not Pake, that's Alice," Daddy said. Pake had grown so much that Daddy hadn't even recognized him. Clearly, Daddy had been away way too long. I was born on March the 28th, 1955. As it happened, that was the only year my folks were without health insurance. And so, as Daddy likes to tell it, he had to sell some hogs to pay for me. Not long after Mom and Daddy brought me home, Oklahoma City took their Boggy Creek property to be a floodplain for a new lake. So Mom and Daddy bought 100 acres south of Limestone Gap. By the time they brought my sister Susie home from the hospital in November of 1957, Daddy had a 3-bedroom house roughed in enough for us to live in. Susie's birth meant that Mama now had 4 kids under the age of 6. But by then, she was an expert at coping during Daddy's absences. She fixed water pumps, stoves, rigs, and washed clothes outside on a Ringer washing machine. Her abilities were a balance for Daddy's. He can do almost anything he makes his mind up to, except be a mechanic. He says if it can't be fixed with baling wire, it can't be fixed. He once tore his shirt and tried to mend it by pouring maple syrup over the tear and putting an encyclopedia on top of it. Mama stayed home till Alice was old enough to take care of us, and then she went back to work, selling fish bait down at the Atoka Lake. I remember how she went to and from work in an old pickup with no brakes or starter. Mama would park the pickup on a hill at night and scotch it with a rock under a tire. Then in the morning, us kids would push it down the slope so she could pop the clutch and force start the engine. She parked it on a hill at work as well and had to pop the clutch to drive it home. Sometimes she went in before daylight and came home after dark. That's when fishermen won't bait. She earned $6 a day in the priceless respect of her children, who never heard her complain. Between Mama's pay and Daddy's rodeo earnings, they began to build up a cattle herd. Strangely, for all the ranching I did, I was never taught to ride. Daddy just took us kids when we were little and threw us up on a horse. We stayed up. It was your basic survival technique. By the time I was 6, I was gathering cattle, and doing it from before daylight until after dark by the time I was 7. It would be 4 a.m. and still pitch dark when Daddy would get us up for breakfast. Daddy would fry bacon, then fry eggs in the bacon grease. The eggs would literally float in the bacon fat. Talk about cholesterol. After Daddy gave us our instructions for the day, Grandpap would translate for us. Daddy was under a lot of pressure and stress from when he worked cattle, and that early in the morning, tempers ran short. When Daddy was in a foul mood, he'd always interpret any questions as back talk, so we didn't dare ask him anything. If one of us did, he'd tell us to pay attention or pull your head out of your ass. I don't know what we would have done without Grandpap, who was sort of our rescuer. We'd chase cattle all day and brush so thick you couldn't ride through it. A lot of times we'd get lost. We'd give a holler that was an imitation of Grandpap's special yell, and when he would respond, we'd go back and forth that way until he found us. Alice was a better hand at working cattle than any man Daddy ever hired, and I've heard him say so. I've seen her ride a horse and to brush so thick that she couldn't see the steer she was chasing. She might come out a bloody mess, but she'd come out with a steer. Our land was just that rough until Daddy had it chained. Now what that means is, a chain big enough to anchor a battleship was strung between two bulldozers. The bulldozers were driven across the land, and the chain bent or uprooted everything. Then the bulldozers would push all the brush into piles, and later Daddy would set it on fire. When I was 6 and Susie was 4, I remember helping Daddy castrate some young bulls. I would stand behind the bull and hold his tail while Daddy sliced the sack and cut the cord that let the testicles fall. Daddy would pass the testicles to me, and I'd put them in a bucket. Next, I'd hand Daddy the penicillin to inject the bull with to prevent infections. Then I'd hand Daddy the knife so he could slit the steer's ears. This was called earmarking. It was a way to identify the cattle as ours, kind of like branding. Many times when we were done, I helped carry that bucket of testicles to the house, and Susie, Alice, and I would sit outside the back door and clean them. We called them mountain oysters. Then we'd take them into Mama, and she'd slice them real thin, roll them in flour, and fry them in hot grease in a huge cast-iron skillet. I was literally raised on mountain oysters. I've been kicked and run over by cattle, but I've kicked them back too. I got so mad one day when the cattle wouldn't go in the chute that I reared back and threw the hot shot, or cattle prod, at the wooden fence. It flew into 10 pieces and hit me right in the forehead. Mom and Daddy didn't say a word. Getting my head cut open was punishment enough for cussing. Daddy didn't accept any excuses. He kept a buggy whip above the door frame, and he'd get it down and snap it across one of us kids' behinds if he thought we needed it. He never warned us. He never told us we were getting on his nerves. He just let us have it. I've been asked if I resented the way Daddy whipped us kids. No, I don't. That's just the way he is. What I did resent were the times I had to work cattle with the men, then go in about 11:30 a.m. to cook dinner, which is what we call the noon meal. We cooked it, the men ate, we cleaned up the mess, then returned back to work with the men. Now, what's wrong with this picture? Me having to cook stopped when I was 11. It was noon one day, and Mama was at work, and Alice wasn't around. I don't know where she was. So Daddy told me, he said, "Reba, you go up to the house and fix dinner." I looked in the cabinets and found a can of green beans, lima beans, and pork and beans. I honestly didn't realize that everything I opened was a variety of beans. "Reba, are you partial to beans?" Daddy asked when he and the rest of the family came inside. Pake, who loves to tell this story, says, "Can you imagine a damn cattle outfit with no meat?" I don't remember Daddy ever sending me to the house to cook dinner again. When we were growing up, I used to regret that Daddy never told us he loved us. I think my Daddy never learned how to show love, like a lot of people, because of his upbringing and him being an only child. Back in 1987, when he had triple bypass heart surgery, I went to see him in intensive care. He had tubes sticking out all over him, and he was still groggy from the heavy sedation. Squeezing his hand, I leaned over to him. I explained that I had to get to a show in Chattanooga, Tennessee the following night. In a faint voice, he said, "Okay, I love you, honey." That was the only time I ever heard him speak those words to me or to anyone else. I never knew how abnormally rough my childhood was until I went home with other kids. Most of my friends had time on their hands to play with toys and things like that. The only time we got out of work was when we went to school. When I came home, I took my school clothes off and put on my everyday clothes to get to work. Mostly, I wore hand-me-downs, either from my cousins or my sister. The only time I received new clothes was at Christmas time. Our one big luxury was a color television, which we got when I was 12. I'll never forget how excited I was. That TV became a nighttime entertainment center at our house. We would vote at the start of the week what shows we were going to watch on which nights. The majority ruled. We made a list and posted it above the heating stove. Believe me, no child today has ever enjoyed a video game more than we enjoyed our 19-inch television that received only 2 channels. Being normal kids, we were full of mischief. Next to the barn, for instance, was a shed where Daddy kept his sick yearlings. We'd tie a rope to the rafters on the barn, and Alice and Pake would swing from the top of the shed over the haystack. At the height of their swing, they'd let go and fall into the mountain of loose hay. I always wanted to try doing things like that, but never had the courage. When I was 10, I stood on top of the shed and braced myself for the swing, but I was simply too scared. I never did take the plunge. That was the McIntyre version of bungee jumping 25 years ago. I wasn't ashamed of being chicken. I felt it was a smart thing to do, not to get hurt. There are many natural perils growing up in the country. The ever-present wasp, the spring tornadoes that would send us running to the cellar in the dead of night, and snakes, which were a constant fear. In Oklahoma, rattlers grow to a frightening size. O'Keene, Oklahoma, 168 miles from Chalky, hosts the world's largest hunt every spring. An average of 1,000 pounds of snakes are picked off the ground in 3 days' time. Some of them are longer than 7 feet. Our hired hand, Louis Sandman, once killed a rattlesnake that was 6 feet long, holding a live rabbit in its mouth. More often than not, there was a lot of fun and laughter coming out of that house in Chalky near Limestone Gap. I recall how Mama had a pink phonograph record player, a Motorola, and a 45 of the Singing Nun singing Dominique. Now, Susie and I couldn't understand a word of French, but my folks had this big dresser in their bedroom with a big old mirror. We'd stand in front of it using their hairbrushes as microphones, and we'd lip-sync the song. And once a week, the 4 of us would come parading down the hall in our pajamas, dancing and singing to the music of 77 Sunset Strip while it was coming on TV. All the time careful not to let our bare feet touch the hot floor where the furnace was. That was our idea back then of a pre-game show. But I especially remember several New Year's Eves when friends and family came from miles around to dance in our brand new living room, a large room built onto our house with money Mama and us kids had saved. Mama put back money from work. Uncle Peck, Grandpap's brother, had given each of us kids a heifer calf when we were little, so that when the calves grew up and had babies, we could sell them. We did just that, and it was our decision to put the money into the living room account. On those New Year's Eves, someone would bring a guitar, another a fiddle, but everyone was required to either bring a pie or a pint of whiskey, of course. Nobody got out of line. There were kids everywhere. I watched those people play music, sing, and dance until daylight, and we sang along too. If someone got sleepy, he could pull up a piece of the floor to sleep on. It was straight out of the Waltons. Special times like these make me realize that music has always been a huge part of my life. Since my daddy rodeoed a lot, naturally we went with him a lot. Some of my fondest memories are those trips my family made to rodeos. At night, Susie and I would sleep on each side of our green Ford's hump on the back floorboard, while Pake slept on the shelf under the back window, and Alice got the seat. Of course, she was the oldest. Going down the road in the dark, listening to the hum of the highway, with our parents in front, was a magical and safe feeling. Sleep and security came easily. But often we'd get jolted out of that peaceful sleep. In those days, there were no interstates, so we'd be traveling on 2-lane highways that passed through small towns. When we'd come up on a red light, the heavy horse trailer we were pulling, which had no brakes, would bump up against the back of our small car, when Daddy would try to stop. And so Pake would fall off the shelf onto Alice, and then both of them would wind up on top of me and Susie sleeping on the floor. You can just imagine the commotion that caused. Our daytime rides had their share of wrestling, too. We were spirited children, and when boredom and restlessness set in, we could get bad about fighting, scuffling, and don't touch me, and Pake did that, and Mama Pake did this. So when Daddy had had enough of it, which wouldn't take very long, he'd let his arm fall from across the back of the front seat and pinch whichever kid he made contact with first. So Mama would get us singing to keep us occupied, teaching us 3-part harmony and songs like Please Mr. Custer, I Don't Want to Go, and I'm So Lonesome Every Day. I can date the start of my professional singing life to a rodeo trip we took to Cheyenne, Wyoming when I was 4 or 5 years old, and we were staying at the Edwards Hotel. One afternoon while we were in the lobby, one of the cowboys asked Pake to sing him a song. Pake sang You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog and got a quarter for it. Not wanting to be left out, I got up and sang Jesus Loves Me. Everett Shaw, our family friend and former world champion steer roper, paid me a nickel. Back then was just like today. The girl singer does as much work as the guy, but she gets less money for it. I've been fighting that all my life. Rodeos were always a major source of fun for us, but we not only watched them, we learned a lot of the skills too. All the time I was growing up, there was at least one of us at the roping pen. Pake would be roping, either team roping, steer roping, or calf roping, and Alice would be practicing running barrels or poles. Barrel racing is where the horse runs as fast as he can, and then stops as fast as he can, turns a barrel, then accelerates as fast as he can, and then does it twice more. 1,500 pounds of horse flesh sitting on 4 ankles not much larger than a man's tries to hurl itself and rider around barrels 3 feet in diameter. I started running barrels when I was 9. Alice won lots of all-around trophies at the quarter horse shows. She had so many she used them as doorstops. Rodeo is simply in the blood of our family. By the time I was 11, I was competing. I would go on to run barrels until I was 21 years old. I was competing in about 50 rodeos a year after I got out of high school. Looking back, though, I think I was an embarrassment to Daddy because I never did that well on the rodeo circuit. I was better in the practice pen than I ever was in competition. It's a wonder that I lasted as long as I did, that I never got hurt. I'd always get so nervous before a competition that I had to struggle to keep from throwing up. I've never been that nervous about singing, even when I've sung for millions of people on primetime international television, such as the Academy Awards. But I still get a few butterflies when I sing the national anthem or sing in an award show in front of my peers. And it used to get me when Mama, who is still my biggest critic, was in the audience. But now that I'm a mama myself, I realize that she'd love me regardless of how I did. Daddy would too. Everyone has special milestones in his or her life, such as their wedding day or their high school commencement. One of mine was my first day at school. On that big morning, my shoes, clothes, and the rest of my attire were placed neatly in a line on the back of the couch in the living room so that I could get dressed close to the old brown heating stove. I wanted to be warm while I slipped from my pajamas into my clothes. The warmth I felt was probably no more than sheer excitement. We didn't have kindergarten in the Kiowa public school system, so my primary education began in the first grade in 1961. In a way, first grade was the real beginning of my performing career. It marked the first time I ever sang behind a microphone. During a Christmas program held in the Kiowa High School gymnasium, I sang Away in a Manger. At the 4-H Club Share of the Fun show, I sang my Sweet Little Alice Blue Gown and won first in the junior individual act division. It was my first trophy. The victory made me like a hunting dog. I had tasted blood and now knew deep within my very soul that I was to be an entertainer. Besides that, I recognized that singing was the best way to get attention. I wasn't the oldest child in the family, nor the youngest, not even the only boy. I was the third child, so the only other way I could get noticed was to make trouble, but that was definitely not the kind of attention I was looking for. By the time I got to junior high school, Pake, Susie, and I were singing more and more together around our house. Sometimes we were the entertainment when Mom and Daddy's friends came over to play dominoes. Alice didn't join us much back then. She was mostly concentrating on her barrel racing. But she really has a beautiful voice. She sings with us if it's a family thing. Pake played the acoustic rhythm guitar and sang the melody. I sang the high harmony and Susie sang the low. People used to ask Daddy where us kids got our talent. He'd say, oh, they got it from their mama. That's so, but we got our lungs from Daddy, and we exercised them early and often during those early years up in the hills gathering cattle and becoming lost, when that famous McIntyre yell saved our hides more than once. But it was Mama who taught us kids to sing harmony. I think that bloodline harmony is a special harmony. The McGuire sisters have it, the Gatlin brothers have it, and so did the singing McIntyres. It's the closest harmony in the world. Mama became very excited about how we'd taken to music, but she wished that we could get more formal musical training. At our school, there wasn't a marching band or even much of music curriculum. Fortunately, that changed when Clark Ryan came to Kiowa High School. He had been a McIntyre family friend for years. In addition to being a teacher, Clark is a professional musician, a fiddle and guitar player who played in honky-tonks around Oklahoma when I was a girl. Clark started teaching at Kiowa High School in 1969 when I was 14. At that time, Mama was working as a secretary to the superintendent of our school, the late Harold Toaz. So with Clark's cooperation, she pitched her boss on the notion of setting up a school country music band, and he said, well, we just might do it. Mr. Toaz's main concern was cost. But we were able to equip 5 musicians with 3 string guitars, an electrical bass, 3 drums, 3 microphones, and 4 amplifiers for about $500. Our first order of business as a band was to decide who could play what. Kelly Ryan and David Jones became our drummers. They took turns, of course. Pate knew how to play the acoustic guitar, and Gary Rayburn became our electric guitar player. Carol Johnson, my cousin Dinah K. Smith, and I were the girl singers, and my sister Susie would join us when she got to junior high school. Pate was the lead singer and also our band leader. We didn't have a bass player, but Roger Wills wanted to try it. Today, Roger is one of the top bass players in Nashville. He was with me for 5 years and now is the band leader for Alan Jackson. Kelly Ryan was not only one of our drummers, but more important, he was my second serious boyfriend. He was also a wonderful kisser. Kelly and I wrote love notes back and forth to each other, and he introduced me to Three Dog Night in Chicago, rock and roll bands with great harmony. When he wasn't playing with us, he was playing bigger jobs that paid more. He was that good. Our band's repertoire really had a range to it. Of the 8 band members, Kelly, Roger, David, and Gary were into rock and roll. Pate, Carol, Diana Kay, and I wanted to do country. So we compromised. Once we got going, the band entertained at all major school functions. We also played at all the school's football games, performing before the kickoff and at halftime. Clark Ryan said, and the band was so much better than the football team that at halftime, if they didn't quit playing, everybody would be down there watching the band and nobody was watching the football game. We had tremendous success for a group of high school kids. The Kiowa High School Cowboy Band grew so popular that it landed some real paying jobs in honky-tonks and dance halls. Now, we couldn't have gotten away with that in Tulsa or Oklahoma City because all of us were minors, too young to legally be inside those places. But in the small towns, it was different. Usually we were asleep by the time we got out of the parking lot of the club. We were a bunch of kids barely in puberty who didn't get to bed until almost daylight after some of our shows. The club audiences could be rough, but they gave us good training in how to work a crowd. Some of those dances turned into fistfights set to music. More often than not, it was so dark in those clubs, we couldn't even see them fighting. We just thought they were all dancing, and we played right through it. When the truth was too obvious to ignore, Clark would tell us, if a fight breaks out to the left, you go to the right. Don't stand there and watch it. Take everybody's attention to the other direction. So we did. Hank remembers a show where Mama told us on the way home that she thought the crowd really enjoyed our music. Why? He asked. Because I counted 14 fights, she said. We were playing in clubs at the time when I was baptized at the Kiowa First Baptist Church and was getting really serious about the right and wrong things in life. One Saturday night when we played Sulphur, I told Mama that when I got on stage, I planned to ask the audience if they were going to go to church the next morning. She just looked at me and smiled. Reba, she said, what makes you think those people don't go to church every Sunday? Well, I was stunned. I never thought of that. Do you think they do? I said. I don't know. But before I got up and started preaching to them and tell them how bad they are, I'd sure find out. That was my first lesson about not judging people. How did I know what they did when they left the honky-tonk? And anyway, it wasn't any of my business. Pate graduated high school 3 years after the band was formed, and shortly thereafter the Kiowa High School Band disbanded. It was never reassembled. While I do have sentimental memories about the group, I can't really vouch for its musical greatness. Recently someone asked Paik, "That man was popular, but was it any good?" "Well, we thought that Nashville was going to be coming through that door any minute and signing every one of us up," Paik said. "Did you ever make a demo or anything?" "No," Paik said, "but we made a tape one time." "Have you listened to it since?" He said, "I listened to it about 5 or 6 years ago. It sounded like a train wreck." Along with singing, basketball, rodeos, and school, I still helped out at the ranch, as we all did. My responsibilities continued even after I left for college. Not that I minded, it takes a lot of hands to run a ranch, and besides I understood that a college tuition would put my folks under considerable economic strain. Although they would eventually reach a level of financial comfort as Daddy parlayed his rodeo earnings into new tracts of land and more cattle, it was a slow build and I wanted to do my share. I went to college in Durant at Southeastern Oklahoma State University, where my major field of study was elementary education and my minor was music. I received my bachelor's degree but never taught school. Durant is about 15 miles from Caddo, Oklahoma, where Daddy ran 200 or 300 steers on some land he leased. "Reba," Daddy said, "it's more handy for you to drive 15 miles every other day to feed those steers than it is for me to drive 45. I said I'd do it. Daddy bought me a black Ford pickup when I graduated from high school. Every other day I'd load about 30, 50-pound sacks of feed into that truck by myself and feed Daddy's steers. I never lost one steer in the 3.5 years it took me to earn my undergraduate degree. The most fun I had while taking care of the cattle was when my roommates and buddies would go with me. One of my roommates, Cindy Blackburn, was a beautiful girl who was always dressed to the max and was a member of one of the campus sororities. One day, Brenda Lee, my roommate in college, and my best friend since the 5th grade, Karen Watkins, my downstairs neighbor, and Cindy and I went to Caddo to feed the steers. We'd had a pretty good day of rain the day before. The dirt in Caddo, Oklahoma, turns to black, gummy mud, and it's real easy to get stuck. I was driving and the girls were in the back of the truck when I hit a boggy spot. The tires started spinning and we began to slow down. I hollered at the girls to jump out and push. Now Brenda and Karen knew better. They'd been there before. They stayed in the truck. But Cindy jumped out in her sorority sweatshirt and saddle Oxford and began pushing with all her heart. When we got out of the boggy spot, I looked back and Cindy was standing there, feet apart, arms out, and covered in black mud. From then on, she always rode in the front of the truck. Of course, I was dating a few guys, having my first serious grown-up romances, and I continued to sing. This was also the first time that I'd ever formally studied music. It was new, unfamiliar, and I learned plenty. During my sophomore year at SOSU in 1974, I had been talking about going up to the National Finals Rodeo in Oklahoma City in December. Daddy asked me, "Why don't you get a job up at the finals? Do something more than just having a big time." I was getting smart enough to know that Daddy knew I wanted to go up and just have a big time. But he was making a point, and I knew I should pay attention. "What do you think I should do?" I said. "Why don't you sing the national anthem?" he said. Well, it seemed like a good idea to me. With the Star-Spangled Banner, everyone stands up, stays quiet, and the best part for any performer, there are 20,000 ears tuned to you. So I called Clem McSpadden, a rodeo announcer who we'd known for years. With Clem's help, I was hired. The NFR is the World Series of Rodeo. It was exciting to be there, and while I didn't know it at the time, it was my first big break. I'll never forget how nervous I felt driving up there with Mom and Daddy. What happened on the day we were supposed to rehearse didn't help my nerves either. I'd gone around to the conductor, Al Good, and explained that I sang the song, the national anthem, in the key of E. He insisted that I sang it in the key his orchestra played it in A. From the look on his face, I could tell we were going to do it that night in A. Well, the rehearsal started and it was time for me to begin. I strained to maintain an uncomfortably high falsetto as everyone kind of looked around like, is that what it's going to be like for a full week? Stanley Draper from the Oklahoma City Chamber of Commerce heard me straining for the notes and went to see Clem. Clem took up for me, telling Stanley that I'd get it and not to worry. The next night, the orchestra played the song in E. During the middle of NFR week, I ran into Ken Lance, owner of Ken Lance's Sports Arena in Ada, Oklahoma, where Pake, Susie, and I performed a lot. I was hurrying off to get ready to sing the national anthem when Ken stopped me. "Hey, Reba," he said, "I want you to meet a good friend of mine." Well, there was Red Stegall, a big old red-headed guy with a gentle look in his eyes. A longtime favorite on the rodeo circuit, who did western swing in the tradition of Bob Wills, he had recorded several top 10 songs and had written hits for other artists. I liked him immediately. I went on about my business, but I would see Red again later during the finals week. The Justin Boot Company had a suite at the Hilton Hotel where the rodeo contestants were staying. So one night after a performance, Mama, Pake, Daddy, and I went over to visit. Red was in the suite that night too, singing and playing his guitar, and passing it around so some of the others in the room could sing. One of the cowboys said, "Hey, Reba, do Joshua." Red didn't know the chords for Joshua, and I didn't play well enough to take the guitar, so I sang it a cappella. As Red put it later, this little red-headed girl started singing, and it just blew me away. Later, Mama asked Red if he could help get a recording contract in Nashville for the singing McIntyres. At the time, Red said, "I just didn't think there was any place for a trio in country music." Well, then in January of 1975, Red Stegall called Mama and said, "Well, Jackie, I've been thinking about it. I can't take all three, but I could take Reba. She's got something a little different." He was asking us to come to Nashville to record a demonstration tape. Red Stegall was offering me a shot. Boy, I was scared. So when Mama and I set out for Nashville in March of 1975, I kept coming up with reasons to stop the car all along the 700-mile trip. I suggested we stop to eat or get ice cream. I wanted to pull over and see every tourist attraction we found. I came up with any excuse I could to delay our trip. "Now, Reba, let me tell you something," Mama finally said. "If you don't want to go to Nashville, we don't have to do this. But if we do, I'm living all my dreams through you." Well, that changed my attitude. When she was a girl, Mama was a wonderful singer. Her dream had been to go to California to try her luck, but her folks said no. The war was on, and she was needed at home. For Mama, responsibility had overridden opportunity. The opportunity I was taking lightly. I realized a chance was being offered to me to do something bigger and maybe better with my life. When Mama told me that, it was just the kick I needed. I told Mama to drive on, and except for gasoline, I'm not sure we stopped again on the entire trip. I made my first demonstration record in a tiny studio. For the session, Red had chosen a song he had co-written, "I'm Not Your Kind of Girl," and 3 other tunes. I returned to school and rodeoing and waited. Finally, after a couple of rejections, Red's partner Joe Light made a pitch to Glenn Keener, who was a producer at Phonogram Mercury. We were pitching the song, "I'm Not Your Kind of Girl," not the singer, Red recalls, because we had the publishing on the song. "I really like this girl," Red quoted Glenn as saying. Eventually, Keener took me, but never did take the song. I signed a deal with Phonogram on November the 11th, 1975. But what about the other singing McIntyres? I've often been asked the obvious and fair question, do Pake, Susie, and I have sibling rivalry? The answer is yes. But it hasn't spoiled our relationship. I love them both with all my heart. Both Pake and Susie sang harmony with me on my early records, and Pake was in 2 of my bands. Even after my first major record on a major label, I Don't Want to Be a One-Night Stand, came out in 1976, Pake and Susie continued to sing with me on occasion. Then Pake came to think that we should split our earnings 3 ways, as we had when we were the singing McIntyres. But he and Susie weren't getting billing then. The bookings were in my name. I could see the arrangement wasn't going to work, and so our careers eventually went their separate ways. In the middle 80s, Pake got a deal of his own on RCA Records and toured for a while as my opening act. Then he decided to stay home with his wife Katie and their 3 kids, and I can sure understand that. But I wish there was a way he could have stuck it out. Call me prejudiced, but I think Pake outsings them all. Susie is a talented gospel singer who travels all over the country with her husband Paul Luxinger. She signed a contract with Integrity Music in 1993. but before that was under the Psalms Ministry label. Richer or poorer, then or now, we have stayed a singing family. It was through rodeoing that I met the man who became the first great love of my life, Charlie Battles. Although I didn't know Charlie personally, I knew a lot about him long before we ever spoke. Charlie was a rodeo star, the world champion steer wrestler in the International Rodeo Association in 1970, 71, and 72. He was ruggedly handsome, with a build a lot like my daddy's. I never even considered that he could ever have a romantic interest in me. Then came the fateful National Finals Rodeo in December of 1974, where I sang the national anthem and met Red Steagall. After one performance, Mom and I went to a Denny's restaurant in Oklahoma City. We were sitting at the counter when Charlie and his wife Sherry walked by. We all began to talk, and Sherry showed Mama pictures of Cody and Lance, Charlie's two boys, and Charlie and I struck up a conversation. I don't even remember what was said. I know Charlie didn't say a lot. He never did. 3 months later, I went with Peg to a rodeo in San Angelo, Texas. Charlie was there, but I barely spoke to him. In fact, I remember more about the stunt that Peg pulled than I do about being around Charlie. It all started one afternoon when I was walking from the pickup and camper where Peg and I were staying up to the Coliseum. We didn't have a motel room and took our showers there in the Coliseum. "Hey, Reba, did you get our hotel room?" Now, the voice belonged to Pax Irvin, a calf roper from Wyoming. He was teasing me in front of a bunch of cowboys, and I was totally embarrassed. I've never liked sexual joking, and I'm not comfortable about flirting either. "No, Pax," I said, "I sure didn't get our room," and I kept on walking. All the cowboys could see my embarrassment, and they just died laughing. I told Pake about the remarks, and he got real mad. Well, I won that night's barrel race, and Pake and I went to the Blue Diamond Bar afterwards to celebrate. We had a few beers, and I guess the thought of what Pax had said to me was burning a hole in Pake's gut. We got back to the rodeo grounds, and we were driving to our parking space by our trailer when we drove by Pax's trailer. There, standing quietly in the moonlight and tied securely, was Pax Irvin's horse. Pake cut off his tail. Now, a horse's tail has a hard core, and hair grows out of that core. Pake cut the hair off right up to the core. Horse hair's real tough. It's used to make fiddle bows. So Pake, using only a pocket knife, had to saw and saw on the tail. Pax's horse became a bobtail nag. The next day, Pax was furious. I never told that story until now, but Pax, 19 years ago you embarrassed me in the light of day, and my brother barbered your horse in the dark of night. The weekend following San Angelo, I went with Beth Crump, my college rodeo buddy and roommate, to the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association Rodeo in Lubbock, Texas. Charlie and Pake were rodeoing together, and they were there as well. They often rodeoed together, Pake roping calves and Charlie bulldogging. That night at the rodeo, I finished with the evening's fastest time, and by the time the competition finished 2 nights later, I was in 3rd place overall. Man, I was so happy. With my 3rd place finish at San Angelo the weekend before, I had more than filled my permit. I was now a professional cowgirl. That night after Beth and I put our horses up, we wound up celebrating. We were drinking lots of beer and having a real good time down at the Cow Palace when Pake pulled Beth into the men's room just to be funny. As things played out, I'd been around Charlie all day. The house lights came on, a signal for everybody to leave because the place was closing. As I walked by Charlie's table, he pulled me onto his lap. We were all laughing, and I turned around and kissed him, full on the mouth. Now, I don't know why I did it. I was just swept up by the excitement of the rodeo, the music, and the beer. It was just impulsive. But kissing Charlie just seemed like the right thing to do at the time. One of the next rodeos that I went to was Fort Smith, Arkansas, and once again I went with Pake, who was once again around Charlie. A week later, I was back at Chalky practicing with Pake down at the roping pen. "Reba," Pake said, "Charlie left his wife." I was shocked, flabbergasted, astonished. Eventually, I would decide that he had left his wife for me, but I honestly had no such thoughts at the time. I just hadn't been around Charlie enough to even think he'd be interested in me. I'd heard that he was unhappily married, but there hadn't been any talk about him getting a divorce. Sherry, Charlie's wife, was a hard-working gal from a big family who was a good housewife. But I couldn't have lived with her either. Sherry and I were as different as night and day. It was a while before Charlie and I really got together. I continued to see him at rodeos. Then he started coming down to Durant pretty often to visit me at college. By the end of July, we were an item. Despite the 10-year age difference between us, Charlie and I had a lot in common, and I think another part of his appeal was that Charlie was so protective. We were at a dance one night, and Bobby Shillings, my old college boyfriend, was there with another girl. We were all on the dance floor when Bobby and I happened to make eye contact. Well, he shot me the bird. "Charlie, let's just leave," I said from out of nowhere. "Let's get out of here." "What for?" Charlie said. "What's the matter? What's wrong?" I wouldn't tell him, but Charlie was never one to let anything lie. He kept pushing. "Did Bobby Shillings do something to you?" I didn't say anything until Charlie and I reached the pickup. Then I thought it'd be okay to tell him. "Well, Bobby flipped me off," I said. That did it. He slammed the pickup door and stormed back to the dance, but Bobby was already gone. A few minutes later, Charlie and I walked into the lobby of the Holiday Inn. There stood Bobby Shillings. Without a word, Charlie just went for Bobby like a little bulldog and threw him through a plate glass window. The glass shattered, and then the lobby fell real quiet. I looked out the window, and Bobby stood quietly and walked away. No one said anything to Charlie, and he and I left the lobby. I was a little shocked and embarrassed by what Charlie had done, but kind of impressed, too. No one had ever fought for me before. But Charlie could be more tenderly supportive, too, and that was the side I was increasingly drawn to. During our courtship, I lost my grandpap, and I was glad to have Charlie help me through it. I was growing to rely on Charlie very much and love him. He was becoming my whole world. No one was surprised when we announced our plans to get married, and the date we chose was June 21st, 1976, the first day of summer. We got married at the Stringtown Baptist Church in Stringtown, Oklahoma on a Monday night. We had a tough time finding anyone to marry us since Charlie had been married before. It was a real short ceremony, and I didn't even have a gown. I just wore a green summer suit. All of my family attended, well, everyone but Pake. He didn't think I should be marrying a man with 2 kids, and time proved him right about that. I personally asked him to come, and he said no, and I said no more. I didn't beg, but I was terribly hurt. Looking back, I've decided there might have been more to it than Pake's disapproval of Charlie's having kids. Pake and I had been extremely close, traveling all over the country together, rodeoing and singing. At that time in my life, he was my best friend. Maybe he resented Charlie for coming between us, but Charlie did take priority. During the first week of our marriage, Charlie and I spent more time apart than together. After the ceremony, we drove to White House, Texas in separate vehicles. Charlie pulled the horse trailer and I drove another truck. I had a singing job and he had rodeos to go to that next weekend. We spent our wedding night in a Holiday Inn in Corsicana, Texas. It wasn't an especially romantic time, as we'd gotten in late. No roses, no champagne. I had to be up early the next day to promote my first single, I Don't Want to Be a One-Night Stand, during an interview at a Houston radio station. That was my honeymoon. I would come to miss Charlie so bad when we were apart, I would cry for 2 days before he left for a rodeo. I was insecure and just plain immature when I got married. I was scared of the dark at 21 years old, too. I'd sleep with my sheet pulled tight to my chin and would never, ever, once I said my goodnights, put my hand outside the sheet for nothing. So I'd ask Charlie not to go to sleep until I did, and he wouldn't. I'd lie next to his big, breathing body, secure and safe by his side. I had never felt so safe. The first home that Charlie and I shared was the Chalky Shack, a small house across the highway from Mom and Daddy's. The ceiling literally fell in twice during the 4 years that Charlie and I lived there. We didn't have running water. The rent was $10 a month. We had second-hand furniture and 2 hand-me-down televisions. One had a picture, the other had sound, and one sat on top of the other so we could see and hear. We thought we were pretty inventive on that one. In those days, we had nothing, but we wanted for little. For a long time, just having each other was enough. The year I was married, 1976, also brought me another great joy. My first professional recording session with Glenn Keener at Woodland Sound Studios in Nashville. Then it was back to Oklahoma. I didn't sit around on pins and needles waiting to become a star. I didn't even expect it. If it was going to happen, it was going to happen. I'll never forget one afternoon in June, the same month I got married, when Mama Susie and I were sitting on the floor in the hall at Mom and Daddy's house. We had the old static field AM radio tuned to KVOO. The disc jockey announced a new record by a new singer, and then I heard my song, I Don't Want to Be a One-Night Stand, on the radio. The three of us just sat there and cried. The song rose to number 88 on Billboard country charts and then dropped off after 5 weeks. Right after our first session, Glenn Keener fell victim to a personal cutback at Mercury. I never worked with him again. I was inherited by Jerry Kennedy, one of Nashville's top producers, who was a great teacher for such a green talent as myself, and also became a great friend. In August of 1977, the album Reba McEntire was released by Polygram Mercury. It produced not one significant hit. People have asked me why I think my career took off so slowly compared to today's singers. Nowadays, an artist will cut one record, have a hit, and will be working for $10,000 a night within a year. The answer is that the recording industry is totally different today. First of all, the coverage we get with videos is unbeatable. You have to perform in a lot of different cities in front of a lot of people to match the visibility you get from the life of one video. Secondly, TNN, the Nashville Television Network, didn't exist when I started back in 1976. It's another wonderful way to showcase new and established acts. Boy, I wish we'd have had it back then. Nowadays, country stations are often number one in their markets. That means that more people are listening to country music than ever before. It sure wasn't that way 18 years ago. When I started out, I had 2 strikes against me. One, because I was a female. With the exception of Loretta Lynn, Dolly Parton, Barbara Mandrell, and Tammy Wynette, there weren't many women who were headline acts in country music. Country concert promoters had to package several acts just to draw a crowd, and the package usually contained no more than 1 female act, if any. Secondly, I wasn't famous. Nashville didn't have the surplus of songwriters in the 70s that it has today, and the good ones wouldn't pitch their songs to an unknown. Why blow a possible hit on somebody not selling records when they could have a guaranteed money-making hit with a superstar? But Jerry did his best to find songs for me. Fact is, Jerry never gave up on me, and I never gave up on myself. And that's a piece of hard-won wisdom I'd pass on to anyone wanting to chase a dream. During the years after I cut my first record, I had to build an audience through tours my agents had arranged for me. Then Red Steagall got me a booking agent, his friend Ray Bingham. He put me in VFW halls, rodeos, honky-tonks, any place he could get. Our biggest money job was at a fair in Missouri for a show and dance. We'd do 3 sets of songs from 9 until 1 a.m. On the first set, the people would stand near the stage to listen. The rest of the sets, they'd dance. We got paid $1,500 for the night. Man, I was thrilled. That's because many of our dates, and we didn't have but 3 or 4 a month, were at places I can best describe as hole-in-the-walls. I can remember playing one club in the early 1980s where the cigarette smoke was so thick I couldn't even see the crowd. Bingham remembers that in one club where he put me, there were always 2 or 3 fights, always among women. Beat all I ever saw, he says. No matter how hard they fought, Reba just kept on singing right through it. That stemmed from my training with the Kiowa High School Cowboy Band. In 1978, I was doing a show in Fort Worth, Texas. I was the opening act. Ray Wally Hubbard's band was supposed to back me, but they didn't want to. They'd never heard of me before. Is there a band that can back me, I asked. Yes, I was told. There's a rock and roll band. I met with the players and told them the songs I did. The musicians were truly in agreement. None of them had ever heard any of my tunes. Okay, I said, do any of you know Proud Mary? Yep, someone said, we know that one. Do you know Jeremiah Was the Bullfrog, I asked, meaning Joy to the World. Three Dog Night, one of them said, we know that song. Great, I thought to myself, they know 2 songs. So to fill my time on stage, I told jokes. I had 3 single records out on a major record label, and the high point of my act was a joke about a duck. Get off the stage, someone hollered. Shut up, take a hike. They were all waiting to hear John Conley, who had his big hit, Rose-Colored Glasses. Well, after my show, I went backstage. I was crushed. Luckily, Mama was with me. She was furious at the crowd. A reporter happened to show up from the Fort Worth Telegram, one of the largest newspapers in Texas. The reporter had seen and heard the crowd's response to me. "Well, are you going to quit the music business?" he wanted to know. "Quit?" I fired back. "Absolutely not. I'm going to get a band of my own and never have this problem again." And I did. The following weekend, I played in South Texas at a cattle sale, and they had a band called Southern Comfort backing me up. I really liked them a lot, and they were interested in becoming my band. The next weekend, we played in Ardmore, Oklahoma. A new drummer joined them. His name was Preacher Williams, who would become my road manager and mainstay for the next 7 or 8 years. During this time, I did manage to achieve one of my greatest dreams. I got my first chance to sing on the Grand Ole Opry. Mama, Daddy, and Alice drove all the way from Oklahoma to Nashville, a round trip of 1,400 miles. They drove it for a 3-minute song. Now imagine this. I had never had a real hit record. I was living in a broken-down shack of a house, and there I was with Minnie Pearl, Roy Acuff, Hank Snow, and other country music legends at the world-famous Grand Ole Opry. We were 4 proud to be their Okies. Then I heard about Dolly. Dolly Parton, one of the biggest stars in the entire entertainment industry, decided to make a surprise appearance at the Opry the night I made my premiere. Most every artist sang 2 songs on the show, but since Dolly was coming, I was cut back to 1. She looked magnificent, as always. She wore a black pantsuit with chiffon, transparent, flowing arms. The outfit was dotted with rhinestone butterflies, Dolly's trademark. Me, I wore a straight denim skirt with a matching shirt. Dolly went on, beaming and smiling all over the room. I was totally in awe, since I was still very shy about performing. But having to follow Dolly wouldn't have been easy for a veteran. That's what I said, follow. I actually had to go on after her. The 4 guys, a quartet that sings regularly at the Opry, had to physically help me on to the center of the stage. I was that nervous. I sang Invitation to the Blues, which I'd sung on my first LP. I can hardly remember getting through it. For a long time, Charlie was fairly indifferent to my career. He wouldn't go with me on many of my shows. His attitude was, "You do your thing and I'll do mine." It was almost as though he felt that he was a world champion steer wrestler, and what was I? Then a turning point came when I started to make money, and Charlie slowed down on his rodeo career when he began to get more involved. In the beginning, I was glad to have his help. My bookings and recordings were now beginning to escalate, getting to be more than I could comfortably juggle. And equally important to me, his involvement meant fewer separations. It seemed like an extension of the protectiveness that had first drawn me to him. It seemed that sharing something so basic to me, my music, could only bring us closer, and it did, for a while. But that's not to say there weren't some major chinks in our marriage. One predictable problem was his children. Anyone who's ever been a step-parent knows that it's not an easy role, and it wasn't always easy when Lance and Cody, Charlie's sons, came to visit us on school vacation in the summers and on weekends. I especially remember one visit the boys made when Charlie and I were living in the Chalky Shack. Naturally, I wanted them to like me. I was nervous and had made a special effort to make our little house as neat and homey as possible. One morning, Lance, Cody, and Charlie got into the pickup to go feed cattle. When I heard the engine running, I came out of the house, heading for the truck, intended to go along. Charlie and I had always fed the cattle together. We were a ranching team. Until that day. "Where are you going?" Charlie asked me. "Well, I'm going to feed with you," I said. "There's not enough room," Charlie said, and closed the pickup door, and he and his sons drove away. I'll never know why Charlie didn't say, "Now, Reba, I think the boys and I need a little time together today." Well, I could have accepted that one. Instead, he just left me standing there while the tailgate faded off into the distance. Man, that just broke my heart. We were still living at the Chalky Shack when I had my first top 10 record, You Lift Me Up to Heaven. It was my career-making record. It went to number 8 on the Billboard charts. It looked like I was finally getting someplace. I think Charlie would have been content to live in the Chalky Shack all of his life. The rent was cheap, $10 a month, which was important because Charlie had come into our marriage in debt. It wasn't his fault. He had gone into partnership to buy some cows with a relative who couldn't pay his part. Still, by our 4th year of marriage, I had begun to dream that Charlie and I could have a house of our own. Then I heard that my cousin Ricky's home in Stringtown might be up for sale. Ricky and her husband Lloyd were living outside Stringtown on 225 acres. It was a beautiful place with pine trees and the Chickasaw Creek running right through it. I'd always loved it. Charlie wasn't into the idea at all at first. He was afraid to get deeper into debt. But at least he agreed to explore getting a bank loan. "It's against my better judgment," the banker said. "I'll never get my money back, but I'm going to give you this loan." The bank got its money back to the penny. In late June of 1980, we moved into that beautiful ranch house in Stringtown. We had 3 bedrooms, running water, no mice, and a ceiling that stayed in place. By 1980, I had developed something of an organization. Red Stegall was acting as my career manager, and Paik was my road manager, though he was getting kind of tired of the job. At that point, we were putting together another band. It included Preacher on the drums, my sister doing the harmony, and Sharky Christian on lead guitar. Paik played the bass. We felt that we needed a steel guitar player, and a man none of us knew was recommended. His name was Narvel Blackstock. At that point, Narvel was an insurance agent who only played music on the side. He had been married at 16 and had 3 beautiful children by the time he was 21. And he loved music enough to drive from Burleson, Texas to Chalky, Oklahoma to meet Paik, 3.5 hours each way, then 2 hours each way to Nowata, Oklahoma, where I was scheduled to play a dance for a VFW hall. Imagine traveling 5 or 6 hours, sight unseen, to try out a gig with a girl singer you'd barely heard of. The job paid $150, yet Narvel was gung-ho. He even quit his steady job before he joined me. I've been thankful ever since that he did. Even as a child, Narvel's desire was to become a professional musician. I think it's really fascinating that he began to play the steel guitar when he was 8 years old. The steel guitar, with its foot and knee pedals, is one of the most complicated of all the stringed instruments. Narvel began his career playing the Pentecostal churches, going on the road with a gospel quartet about the time he began to shave. Those early experiences would be great training for the life he would finally be facing in my band. Narvel's initial gigs with me show a pretty clear picture of my performing life in those years. Even though I had a top 10 hit, you might call my operations somewhat less than professional. We arrived in Nowata, Narvel remembers, and we were supposed to play a show that night, but we had never played a note together. Reba had bought a brand new sound system, but nobody in the band knew how to hook it up. They finally got it hooked up about the time people were starting to come into the hall. We still hadn't rehearsed, and I still hadn't even seen Reba. Narvel would learn later that I hate to rehearse. My voice gets tired if I try to sing with each run-through, so I want to save it as much as possible for actual performing. I guess you could say I'm pretty lazy in that respect. Finally, I arrived with Charlie and Susie right before the show, and Narvel swears we all just walked into the hall and never spoke to him. Well, I don't remember. When the show ended, Narvel recalls that we 3 left without ever saying more to him than hello. By that time, he says, I sure wondered what kind of a deal I got myself into. Amazingly, Narvel came back. Susie and I traveled from show to show in a Lincoln Continental. The 5 guys in the band rode in our leaky van, which pulled the horse trailer that carried the instruments. The guys took turns driving through the night. When we arrived at our destination, we would get 2 hotel rooms, one for me and Susie and the other for the band, who would split the mattresses into 2 double beds and put the 5th guy on a rollaway. Their room would often be so jammed with bedding that no floor space would show, and the guys would have to walk across the top of the beds to get to the bathroom. At any time, Narvel could have gone back to the economic security and suburban comfort of the insurance industry. I was getting a lot of pressure at home to quit because I wasn't making enough money, Narvel says, but I had gotten to the point where I knew that music was where my heart was. That's how Narvel came into a band he never left. In 1982, Narvel told Mama he believed in me tremendously. I'll be around long after everybody else has quit, he said, and he is. I'd hate to try to guess how many miles I traveled during the 1980s. So when I got my first bus in 1982, a 20-year-old Silver Eagle, it was really a big event. For a touring singer, finding a good bus driver can be as important as finding good musicians. I'm a light sleeper, and since we travel at all hours, I had to look hard to find someone who could drive smoothly. Then, too, especially in those early years, my drivers had to be good mechanics. My first driver, Wormy Miller, once had to get under the bus with a broom handle to try to force the transmission into reverse. After Wormy, we got a driver who the band nicknamed Salmon X Rex, 'cause he was so slow. He used to make U-turns in the middle of 4-lane traffic. He scared us all to death. Then in 1983, we hired a real doozy who only lasted 17 days. When we were in Davenport, Iowa, after our show, he drove through a side street underpass and almost got the bus stuck in the tunnel. I could hear the lug rack on top of the bus being scraped off as he tried to force the bus through. "Stop! Stop!" Everyone on board started yelling. The new driver made things worse by trying to claim the bus had cleared that same underpass on the way to the show. "Someone laid asphalt on the road while we were at the concert," he said, "and now the road's higher." Whew. We got out of that scrape by letting the air out of the tires and backing out. Finally, we found Larry Jones. But we quickly learned that Larry had never driven a bus in his life. He didn't know how to start it or put it in reverse. The night Larry drove us to the rodeo we were playing, all eyes were on the new guy. Folks who travel for a living have a way of watching the one who drives them. It was dead silence, Larry remembers. I was thinking, this is my big test. I got to this one place and had to make a U-turn. I thought, God, this is it. I'm exposed. But he finished the turn and the bus broke out into applause. There is no rhyme or reason for some of the things that happen on the road. Sometimes you have to think God is behind them. One time, Sherry McCoy, my hairdresser, and I flew to Kansas City, Missouri, where Larry met us with the bus. When we reached the hotel, we discovered we had no reservations. That's when we learned that Kansas City, Kansas, and Kansas City, Missouri have hotels with the same name. We were in the wrong Kansas City. I remember that the weather was extremely cold, icy, and snowy. We drove around a while trying to find our hotel, and finally I told Larry to stop and call for directions. He pushed the 0 button on the telephone. It froze inside and wouldn't come out. So we stayed lost. Larry ended up driving around Kansas City, Kansas for 4 hours. We were lost long enough for me to watch on the TV a videotaped movie, another 1-hour program, and the 10 o'clock news. But surely it was God's plan for me to see that news broadcast, with a feature on all of the homeless people who were freezing out in the elements. It really tore me up. Here I was in a nice customized bus with the heater running full blast, and these people were searching for shelter to save their lives. I felt guilty, but I decided to do something about it instead. So the next day, when Sherry, Renee, my niece, and I went to Walmart after my rodeo show, we picked out socks and compact cases with toothpaste, shampoo, and other stuff. I got lots of pillows and blankets, too. Now, when the girls and I were taking the stuff through the checkout lines, the cashier recognized me and asked me why I was buying so much. I told him about seeing the homeless on the news the evening before. Walmart is a family-oriented kind of place, so the cashier offered me a 10% discount on everything. Of course, I didn't ask for the discount, but by the next day, a newspaper story claimed that I had bickered over the price with the people at Walmart. I thought that was kind of tacky of the newspaper. But that hurt was overshadowed by my gratitude that God had let me be in a position to help. The Walmart folks volunteered to send the items over to the people at the rescue mission for me, since I had another show that night. I had begun to realize that it was time to get serious about my career. I needed to take more control of my performing life, and I started by getting more choosy about the places where I sang. A touring entertainer never knows what a place is like if he's never played there before. Some places have swanky names, and you drive all day and night to get there to find out they're not so swanky. That was especially true in my early days when I was playing the honky-tonks. It's not that I have anything against honky-tonks, but I always had a terrible time singing through all the cigarette smoke, which I had grown allergic to. For 5 years, with my burning throat and running eyes, I'd felt like I'd been singing in rooms full of ammonia. I remember the inside of the last honky-tonk I ever played. It was in 1982. After the show, my sinuses were killing me. I went to the motel and called Charlie that night. "I'm not playing another club," I said. "Don't book me in another nightclub." "Well, you just ruined your career," Charlie said. "I don't care," I said. "If I have to continue to sing in that smoke, I won't have a career because I won't have a voice." I had made my decision and I stood by it, and I honestly think my low tolerance of smoke was God's way of telling me to get out of the nightclubs and get onto the concert stages. Then on December the 12th, 1982, the Statler Brothers asked me to tour with them as their opening act. I know in my heart I wouldn't have been a part of their tour if I hadn't have put my foot down about singing in clubs. After the Statler Brothers, I opened for Conway Twitty, Ronnie Millsap, and Mickey Gilley. Besides literally and figuratively cleaning up our act, there were other important measures I had to take to really get a grip on my career. Red Stegall, who had been overseeing my career, convinced me that the time had come to bring in a professional. He was good enough to introduce me to Don Williams. Then Narvel approached Charlie and said he thought the band needed a leader. "Well, if you think we need one and you want to be one, then you're it," Charlie told Narvel. By then, Charlie and I knew Narvel very well and trusted him immensely. To other players, working for me was a job. For Narvel, it seemed to be a career. He was always coming up with ideas to improve the show or our travel conditions. That drive and enthusiasm are what made Narvel the best partner I ever had. My final step toward professionalism was getting myself an agent, but I almost lost my chance through no fault of my own. In March 1981, I was scheduled to perform at the Mabee Center at Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The William Morris Agency folks were going to be there to check me out. I was nervous about performing for the representatives. Two had flown in all the way from New York City just to watch me. On that all-important showcase, I appeared with Red Stegall, a local band, and George Jones. The 17,000-seat hall was filled to overflowing. George Jones made no secret of the 30-year battle he had with alcohol. He got the nickname No-Show Jones for all the dates he missed because he was too drunk to go on stage. When he arrived at the Mabee Center show, he started to drink. George's road manager went to Kathy B., who had booked the entertainment, and told her she'd better put Jones on stage while he was still in good shape. "I can't," Kathy said. "Reba's got folks here from William Morris waiting to watch her, and Jones is supposed to be the headliner. He's supposed to close the show." Jones suddenly announced he wouldn't go on at all if Kathy didn't find him a girlfriend. Now, Kathy is a wise old gal who's been around drinking men before. "Okay," she finally told George, "we'll compromise. You go on stage now and do your show, and when you come off, I'll have your girlfriend right here." So George went out, did his 45 minutes, and walked off stage directly to a bottle and to Kathy. "Where's my girl?" Jones demanded. "George," Kathy said, "that girl is a no-show." Well, George became angry and left. By then the lineup was hopelessly out of order, and a local band closed the show starring George Jones. But the next day, the Tulsa World published a review that said in part, "Reba McEntire is destined to become country music's next female superstar." By the way, Tom Carter, who was at the time a reviewer for the Tulsa World, wrote that review. No wonder I selected him as my co-writer. Not long after that, I was signed by William Morris, and even though Starstruck books my tours today, William Morris still handles my movie and literary contracts. And I'm happy to say that with the help of his wife Nancy, George won his battle with the bottle. They are a wonderful, happy couple, and I love them both very much. In 1983, the band and I were sitting in a garage in DeSoto, Texas, but not by choice. The lug nuts of the front left tire of Old May, my bus, had loosened so much that we were afraid to go any further without having it checked. While the mechanic was wrestling with the tire, I called my manager, Don Williams. "Your song just went #1, he said. Man, I couldn't believe it. There in that greasy garage, I began to bawl. It finally happened. The one thing Mama and I had waited on for a lifetime, my first #1 song, was Can't Even Get the Blues. It had a storyline people could relate to, about a woman whose man had left her, again, and it doesn't bother her anymore. It was a strong woman's song. The song belonged to Loretta Lynn's publishing company, and when it went to #1, she sent me a beautiful silk flower arrangement that I cherish to this day. Later, she sent me a beautiful diamond necklace that was stolen from my suitcase a few years ago. Man, I hated to lose that necklace because it was from Loretta. I'm proud to say that I'm one of her friends, and she certainly is one of mine. She's a sweet, fun person to be around, and quite a character. In 1981, I'd gotten to be a part of a wonderful television special, Johnny Cash and the Ladies of Country Music, 20 of us, with Johnny being the only man. I was so honored to be chosen because I was really just getting started out then. I hadn't even done my first major tour. Johnny did a very generous thing for that show. He furnished gowns for all the ladies, and at the end of the taping, gave them the gowns to keep. Mine was a beautiful aqua slim-styled evening gown with spaghetti straps. Not many television hosts would have even thought to make such a kind and sensitive gesture, and I, for one, was very grateful. It's that kind of open-heartedness, along with his great music, that has made Johnny Cash a legend. He has never lost sight of his roots. Then 2 years later came my chance to meet the other Johnny, Johnny Carson, the late-night king himself and host of the granddaddy of all the network television shows. On that first Tonight Show date in 1983, for good luck, and because I couldn't afford anything else, I wore that same dress that Johnny Cash had given me for his TV special. Naturally, I was a bundle of nerves, but when I met Carson backstage before the show, he was very nice and gracious. I was to sing 2 songs, with Narvel playing the steel guitar with the Tonight Show orchestra, and Susie singing harmony from inside a sound control booth. Neither of the songs was my #1 record, Can't Even Get the Blues. Instead, the producers asked me to sing You Lift Me Up to Heaven, my first top 10 record, and Only You, the old Platters song I'd done a remake of. I wouldn't get the real guest treatment, the chance to be called to the interview couch, until my 3rd appearance. That time Johnny questioned me about my background in rodeo, and I explained that I'd been a barrel racer. Oh, he seemed so fascinated by the way I said barrel and kept asking me to repeat it, impersonating me and making fun of how I said barrel. Well, Johnny's from Nebraska, and that's about as rural as Oklahoma. I guess he lost his Nebraskan accent a long time ago. But in hindsight, I can see that Johnny meant no harm. He was just trying to break the ice for me. I would go on to have one more #1 song with Mercury, You're the First Time I've Thought About Leaving, among the 70 songs I recorded there. I just didn't feel that Mercury was pushing my songs hard enough, and they, in turn, had to be unhappy with my sales. I was grateful that Mercury had stuck with me and had supported me for the 8 years I was with them, but I felt it was time to move on. Looking back, I see that the best things that ever happened to me in my life happened when I went with my gut feelings. If I go by my heart or by my gut, I usually don't go wrong, and this time was no exception. During the time I had been looking for a new record label, I had also begun to think I needed a new manager. Don Williams had helped me an awful lot, but his offices were in Los Angeles, so Charlie and I rarely saw him. So we decided to go with Bill Carter, who had been Don's lawyer. Bill Carter knew how my business worked, and he was the one who confirmed my new contract with MCA. In those early days, the early 1980s, everybody in country music was trying to record crossover songs that would attract the pop music audience. So I thought to myself, do the opposite. Besides, country was the music that I loved and wanted to record. When my producer Harold Shedd, who produced my second album on MCA, wanted to put an orchestra on my new album, I put my foot down. I want to record my kind of country, I insisted. My kind of country is the clear, pure, old-fashioned kind, emotional and gutsy and also sentimental. The songs tell about real human problems, love and heartbreak and loss, in a way that shows you that the singer is no stranger to pain and is tough enough to survive. One person I had to convince was Jimmy Bowen, the record industry legend and president of MCA's Nashville division. When I met with Bowen, I knew I had to get him on my side. I gave him the tape I'd made of the kinds of songs I wanted to record, songs like Merle Haggard's Mama Tried, Dolly Parton's Jolene, and Loretta Lynn's If You're Not Gone Too Long. And he listened to it. I can get great musicians for you, Bowen remembers saying. I can make you sound great, but if you don't know what a woman should say to cause another woman to get up from her house and drive clear across town to sort through KISS posters just to find your record, then you're not going to make it. That's what you've got to be able to do. That's what I wanted to hear. Man, I love a challenge. So I told him, sure, I can do that. He put me in touch with Don Lanier, his artist and repertoire chief, who is nicknamed Dirt, and we started to visit the publishing companies, lots of them, to listen and find the songs that would complete my mission. I had to go back 20 years in the publishing company's catalogs to get the country music I wanted. Bill Carter has suggested that I approach the highly respected Harlan Howard, whom the Nashville media calls Mr. Songwriter. He wrote the classics Heartache by the Number and Pick Me Up on Your Way Down, as well as one of the most haunting country songs of all time, I Fall to Pieces for Patsy Cline. I felt like I was in the presence of royalty when I settled into the big wing-back chair at Harlan's house. Charlie and I sat there quietly as Harlan loaded his tape machine. I listened carefully as he played me a batch of tunes, but I was a little disappointed. They weren't what I expected from Harlan Howard. I said, "Have you got anything else?" And he said, "Yes." Then he played Somebody Should Leave. Boy, I started tearing up. I got chills all over me. I said, "Harlan, can I have that song?" He smiled real big and said, "Do you like it?" "I love it." Then he said, "Yep, you can have it." I knew then that Harlan Howard was testing me. If I had liked all those other songs, he would never have played me Somebody Should Leave. Up until then, I was more or less just a singer. I was really totally ignorant about the business. Then I came to realize that the difference between a singer and being an artist could rest on something so simple, though hard to achieve, as my belief in myself. Bowen gave me a very great gift, the right to control my own music, and a great deal of wise advice. And I thank him for both of them. My Kind of Country helped kick off what the national magazines called the New Traditionalist Movement, a revolution in country music that they credited to Randy Travis, Ricky Skaggs, George Strait, and me. Of course, none of us set out to spawn an entire musical movement. We had just been looking to record good, solid country music, the kind we had grown up with, the kind that ran steadily in our veins. I've always believed that the heart of entertainment is performance, not just producing a studio version of your work. And one of the most important lessons I've learned is that you're never as good as you could be. I've never stopped trying to improve my act, whether it would be my hair and costumes, or songs, or how my shows are staged. Early on, for instance, I was very insecure. I would try to find nice clothes, but for a long time I couldn't afford them. I put everything I had into looking nice, but I just didn't know how. And when I'd go out and sing, I didn't know how to talk to the audience. After my first choreographer, Andre Tailleur, watched me sing, the first question he asked was, "Why aren't you looking at me?" "Well, 'cause you make me nervous," I said. "You should look at the audience," he told me. "Then take your eyes from person to person and go down the rows like a typewriter. That's the way to really reach an audience." "Good Lord, that's awfully personal," I said. "Well, where do you look?" he asked. "At the exit signs," I said. One of the reasons I looked at the exit signs was to keep from choking up during the delivery of songs like Somebody Should Leave. But I followed Andre's suggestions to the T, and I know it really made a huge difference in my performing. I also began to experiment with stage lighting. Narvel, then still my steel guitar player, had a plan to turn off all the stage lights after our last songs on one of our shows. Everyone would leave the stage in total darkness. Then we'd turn up the moody blue lights, and I'd come back on stage to sing my encore song, the Patsy Cline classic, Sweet Dreams. The first night we tried it, I could barely see the exit signs, and I fell right over the top of a speaker monitor. I hit my stomach and shins, ripped my new satin pants, then I crawled over the monitor. Tom Bresh, who had opened the show for me, was sitting on a stool at stage right. I literally went hand over hand up his stool to stand up. He didn't even try to help me up. He just looked down at me with his arms crossed and said, "Good show, Reba." Somehow I managed to gracefully hobble out to do Sweet Dreams, and later the band and I laughed for days about our first try at a big production number. I sometimes thought that Charlie felt demeaned by my becoming more successful, getting lots of attention, and making more money than he did. I knew some folks found Charlie distant and difficult to work with. At the time, I preferred to see his aloofness as a natural reserve, his occasional brusqueness with musicians as perfectionism. After all, he wanted things to be just so for us. But as my bus driver, Larry, says, he never had to ask if Charlie was coming to a show with us or not. All he had to do was just look at me. Charlie caused that much tension. And Larry remembers how Charlie would call me a wench right in front of me when he was talking to the band. I tried hard not to let our professional problems affect the personal life we shared, and vice versa. But what I had once admired and loved best about Charlie, his protectiveness, now revealed itself as a domineering nature, and it was starting to cause trouble between us. I'm not saying that I was perfect myself. I can recall, for instance, when we were newly married, feeling impatient and hurt by some of Charlie's behavior after an afternoon performance at a rodeo in Louisville, Kentucky. We had agreed to meet back at the trailer, but when he didn't show up, I finally went out to look for him, only to find him having a beer with the other cowboys and shooting the breeze. Maybe I should have been more understanding about his needing time with the guys. Maybe he shouldn't have broken our plans and left me to worry if he was laid up in a hospital somewhere with a broken neck. I do know that when I walked into that bar and spotted him there, my relief at seeing him all right turned into anger, and I came up to him like some crazed gunslinger out of the Old West. It didn't make either one of us look too good in front of his buddies, and I can't blame him for being upset about that. But there was one incident that still stands out in my mind as being pretty unforgivable, sadly showing the spirit of our marriage. Charlie loved to trade. He'd buy something he didn't need and sell something he did just to be trading. I'd come off the road and we'd have a new car. I'd come home a few days later and Charlie'd replace the car with an orange Bronco. Trading was his hobby, and sometimes I think it was an addiction. He enjoyed it, and usually I really didn't mind. But I had one special possession, a gentle sorrel horse named Legs. I was on the road so much that I rarely got to ride him, but I loved to when I got the chance. He wasn't valuable to anyone but me, I thought. One day when I came off a tour, I went out to the barn. Legs was gone. When I asked Charlie about my horse, his answer was brief. I sold him, he said. I was speechless. "Why did you sell my horse?" I finally choked out, so mad I was almost crying. "I got a good buy on him," Charlie said. All Charlie had considered was the deal. He didn't even think that he had to talk to me before selling him. I was upset at losing Legs. I would never have parted with him. But what really shocked me and pained me was Charlie's failure to even think of my feelings. 1984 brought me the tremendous honor of being named Female Vocalist of the Year by the Country Music Association, the first of 4 times I would receive that award. Believe me, it's a tremendous thrill to receive the recognition of your peers. All artists have a certain amount of competitive drive. You have to keep touring and creating, to see your records fail, yet keep the faith that they'll succeed someday. So it's especially meaningful to receive a sign of your fellow musicians' regard. I will always feel grateful for that. I did have one frustration with the awards process itself, though, that stirred up a lot of controversy. My trouble had to do with the way the artist press ceremony was arranged back then. The awards were presented at the Grand Ole Opry House, and afterwards the CMA would have all the winners go upstairs to meet the press. After all the interviews were finished there, we were shuttled to the Opryland Hotel a mile away, where we would meet another bunch of reporters in the ballroom. All this moving around stretched the country music industry's biggest night of the year to 2 a.m. or so, and by then everyone was exhausted. By contrast, at the Grammys, the American Music Awards, and the Academy of Country Music Awards, each winner talked to reporters backstage immediately after his or her award presentation, and then was permitted to go back, watch the rest of the show, and later attend all the fun activities and parties. Well, in 1985, I suggested through my manager that the CMA do the same thing the other associations did. But tradition doesn't break easily. I repeated my suggestion in 1986 and was told by one CMA spokesperson, "You'll go where we tell you to go and do what we tell you to do. You're just lucky to be here." "Okay," I said, "thank you very much." That year I was honored with 2 awards, Female Vocalist of the Year for the 3rd time, and at the end of the evening, the greatest prize in the world of country music, Entertainer of the Year. I cried with joy, and then I returned to my seat in the audience. When the show was ended, Charlie and I headed out the side door to a waiting limousine. Someone from the CMA rushed up to us saying, wait a minute, where are you going? You have interviews to do." "I told you I wouldn't do any interviews under these circumstances," I said, and then I left the building. I wasn't trying to act like an uppity star, although some in the CMA might have thought so. I'm happy to say that I ended up winning my 4th Female Vocalist of the Year award in 1987. But I'm almost as pleased to say that since then, the CMA has restructured its artist press ceremony to help the artists face the press with all their wits about 'em, all the better to carry the banner of country music. But getting back to the CMA Award Show of 1986, about a week after I was named Entertainer of the Year, I had the most touching surprise, and it came in the middle of the night. I had been on tour and was riding through Atoka, about 18 miles from home, when Larry Jones called me from his driver's seat in the bus. I stumbled sleepily to the front of the bus and peered out the windshield. There, on billboards and marquees, even trees, were signs made by my neighbors and friends welcoming me home as Entertainer of the Year. My eyes filled with tears. The local folks had worked hard to make those signs and had made sure the signs stayed up until I came home 7 days later. Thank you, all my friends. I had another hit song that year, Whoever's in New England, one that did more to broaden my audience than any other record I'd made so far. Songs like that are called career records, and this one was my first. I never set out to record a crossover record. As I've said, I've always considered myself a country artist and never wanted to abandon my roots. I had simply come to the conclusion that it would be better for me to just do good material, and if it happened to reach across the pop charts, well, fine. That would be an unexpected extra. Despite the success we seemed to be having, Charlie and Bill Carter seemed convinced that I had peaked. Their attitude depressed and confused me. But Charlie's lack of enthusiasm for new ideas wasn't the only problem. It seemed like nothing was going right between the two of us, professionally or personally. It was clear that some kind of blow-up was bound to come. One day in 1984, after Charlie and I had gone to Colorado to shoot the album cover for My Kind of Country, we drove back to Denver to catch our plane in near silence. It seemed that we didn't speak except to argue. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Charlie said, "What do you want, a divorce?" It was the first time that word had been spoken between us. "Absolutely not," I snapped, but I didn't know for sure if I meant it. 2 years later, we should have been rejoicing over our 10th-year wedding anniversary, and would have been if there had been much joy left in our marriage. So instead of having a celebration, Charlie and I went to Hawaii to try to repair our relationship. We came back after just 3 days. There was an incident in Dallas when we were shooting the video for The Last One to Know that reveals just how estranged we had become. We were riding together on the bus to our next location shoot when we stopped for a red light at a corner where there were flower sellers, and Charlie said to the guys, "Watch this." Opening the door of the bus, he leaned out and bought a rose. "This will make it better," he told them. "This will fix everything." He smirked as he carried the rose to the back of the bus, setting it beside me on the bed. How could he behave as if our problems were so minor that one small gesture could fix everything? Since Charlie had insisted on coming along, I was an emotional wreck the entire time we were filming, though the video, in the end, turned out okay. The next night, I was booked to do a show in Lubbock, Texas, and I knew that I just couldn't do it with Charlie there. When I asked him not to come, telling him that I simply needed some time alone, Charlie became furious. "I'll get my stuff off the bus," he said. Trying to calm him down a little bit, I asked him, "Do you need any money?" "No," Charlie said, "I got $400 out of your purse." All I could say was, "You did what?" Well, that set him off. I'd never confronted Charlie about the money, even while I was clearly the breadwinner. That was a big no-no. Then one thing led to another. And for the first time in our life together, I thought Charlie was going to hit me, as he reared back with his shaving kit in his hand. But he didn't. Charlie had calmed down, and he just packed up his things and left for Stringtown. I felt relief that he was gone, and once again my gut feelings were reminding me that it was time to get out. I found it sort of fitting, in a way, that he had threatened me with the shaving kit. I'd had it made for Charlie and wrapped it, lovingly and carefully, to give him one Christmas when we were first married. I meant it as a special gift, but when I set it on his lap, he let his 2 young sons tear the wrapping to shreds. They were just little kids, of course, who didn't know any better, but Charlie never tried to stop them. He just laughed. I was so hurt that he didn't seem to notice all the care I'd taken, and that he didn't seem to value a gift from his wife enough to want to open it himself. That shaving kit was symbolic of all that had become unbearable to me about our marriage. Throughout all these conflicts, Charlie Carter and I had been planning one of the most important shows of my career, a night at Carnegie Hall. Carnegie Hall is, of course, the foremost concert stage in America, the place that, when you play it, signals that you have arrived as a serious artist. At least that's what I thought. My debut at Carnegie Hall was set for October the 28th, 1987. At that time, the majority of people who attended country music shows at Carnegie Hall were walk-ups, folks who waited until the night of the concert to buy their tickets. 10 days before the show, Bill Carter remembers, we considered canceling. We hadn't yet reached that point with our daily ticket counts where we were comfortable, so we were just freaking out. Not only did we stand to lose a lot of money, but it would be very embarrassing to have a poor turnout at Carnegie Hall. The night of the show, as I walked out onto the stage, I was kind of in a trance. I looked out past the spotlights to see the crowd. I couldn't believe it. They were all on their feet. I got a standing ovation before I ever sang a note. That really choked me up. Our fears about ticket sales and all those months of worry had been totally in vain. Hundreds of people had to be turned away. I had gone in the back way, so I hadn't seen them, but in Carnegie Hall tradition, posters announcing that the tickets were gone papered the outside of the building. A black sold-out sign was streaked across my name. I wished I had gotten one of those posters as a souvenir. Charlie and I split up right in the middle of the planning of my Carnegie Hall debut, and our divorce was final 2 weeks after the show, although the money questions weren't settled until after the first of the year of 1988. After the shaving kit incident, Charlie had gone home to Stringtown, and I'd gone on to my show in Lubbock, Texas. When I'd gotten home on Sunday, it was our 11th wedding anniversary. The next morning we drove to Tulsa, where my daddy was in St. John's Hospital having some tests done on his heart. The test would reveal that Daddy needed to have triple bypass surgery right away. I remember the date, June 22nd, 1987. On our drive to see Daddy, I said to Charlie, "If I ever asked for a divorce, what would you do?" He said, "I'd ask for 10% of you for the rest of your life." At the hospital the next morning, I told Charlie that I wanted him out of my career. From the hospital payphone, Charlie called Narvel, who had been handling all the tour managing, and who was now going to take over everything but Bill Carter's responsibilities. "Well," Charlie told him, "Reba's going through a little thing here. Don't worry, I'll help you through it. She'll get over it in a bit, and I'll get back in there." Charlie was just not getting it. I told Charlie to go on home, that I would meet my bus the next day to go to my show in Tennessee. Then I went back to Daddy's hospital room. Mama was there reading a book, so I took out my little white Bible. The pages fell open to Ephesians, and I read a scripture that said something like, "He is the fool that looks back while plowing the field." It seemed to be saying to me, "Don't look back, look forward." I felt like God had sent me a direction. I closed my Bible and asked Mama, "You want to go downtown with me?" "What for?" she said. "Well, I'd like to file for divorce." I thought my parents might try to argue with me, but all Mama said was, "Sure." And Daddy said, "What took you so long?" Somehow Charlie found out about me filing for divorce before he was even served the papers. He withdrew all the money we had deposited in the McAllister Bank. It was later put back so the courts could decide how everything would be split up. But that spirit never left Charlie. In 1993, I asked my collaborator, Tom Carter, to give Charlie a chance to tell his side of the story. At first, Charlie said he'd do it, but then he changed his mind. He said if I would pay him $500 for the bet I took when I left, which I didn't, and a fee for just talking, he never said how much, he might agree to the interview. I told Tom not to call him back, just to forget it. I had only been trying to do right by Charlie, to give him a chance to tell his side. But I guess he didn't want to accept that. While I'd agreed to give Charlie our 215-acre ranch and our house, the judge awarded him what turned out to be $580,000. I was astounded at the inequity. Charlie had been a benefit to my career, and I had testified as much, but it was hard for me to see why he deserved so much of our net worth. After the divorce was final, the Atoka County newspaper ran a front-page story about it, which was picked up on the AP wire and circulated all over the country. That story brought me a scolding letter from a fan, who wanted to know how dare I get a divorce when she had looked at me as a role model. That brought everything into perspective. Certainly I believe that marriage should be for life, but things don't always work out according to our beliefs. I'd made mistakes in my life, but I learned from my mistakes, and then I go on with my life. Sure, I could say I wish I'd never married Charlie Battles, but that's not true. I loved Charlie with all my heart. I wanted to marry him, and for much of our marriage I was very, very happy. I'm very uncomfortable being seen as a role model in that way. No one is perfect but God, and that's what I told the fan when I answered her letter. That she should look to him as a role model, not to me. I moved to Nashville after the divorce. I found a large house in a very pretty part of town where all of us, the transported Okies, could stay. Sherry McCoy, my hairdresser, made the move with me, and so did Cindy Owen, a friend from Jackson, Mississippi. Larry Jones was still my bus driver and pretty much acted as my bodyguard and protector, moved into the apartment over the garage. Work became my refuge after the divorce. It's funny, I had grown so accustomed to the status quo, to the strain and icy cold tension. But now touring got to be much more fun and much less pressured. I'm so grateful that the people in my organization, Sherry, Cindy, Larry, Narvel, and others, rallied around me during those hard days. One of the ugly facts about divorce is that it always affects more than two people, and almost every member of our work family had been friends with Charlie. I know our split was uncomfortable for everyone, and I suppose it was inevitable that certain friends would drift away. I had another parting of the ways to deal with during that troubled time. I asked Bill Carter, my manager of 4 years, to let me go. Carter recalls that he wasn't surprised. Once I had gotten rid of Charlie, he says, he expected to be next. Perhaps Narvel's explanation says it best. When Reba divorced Charlie, Bill Carter immediately said, "Okay, Charlie's gone, I'll take control of everything." What Bill didn't realize is that's exactly what Reba was running from. I wanted new enthusiasm and ideas from a new manager, and the person who I turned to was Narvel. With him to help me, I could really begin to take charge of my career. Narvel and I always had a practice of studying and watching what other artists and companies were doing, learning not only from their accomplishments, but also from their mistakes. And I'm proud to say that because of it, our operation is one of the best in the business. There was a confusing shift in my emotions during this time. Without ever expecting to, or even wanting to feel that way, I had been finding myself drawing closer to Narvel. I had always trusted him and was excited to find our ideas so much in sync, especially now, during the renewal of my organization. But in the 7 years we've been working together and traveling together, I had never before thought of him romantically. Narvel's a very good-looking man, and from the first night he played with us at the VFW Hall in Owata, Oklahoma, it was obvious that many women were staring at him. Now, I had eyes too, of course, and I could see what all those women were appreciating. But Narvel was married, and so was I. And even if I hadn't been, I was still Narvel's boss. He was the cornerstone of my organization, and it would have been crazy for me to jeopardize our business relationship. And, to be fair, Narvel had never taken the slightest interest in me. He saw me only as his employer. Throughout the unhappy unraveling of my marriage and into my early, unsure days of being alone, Narvel was my anchor, always there to say, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." That dependability and devotion from him perhaps inevitably sparked some response in me. But it would take a long time for us to come together, and almost as long to recognize what was happening between us. It's funny thinking about it now. In some ways I believe we went out of our way to keep our distance. For example, a lot of my old band members and I would give each other hugs, but Narvel and I, never. When we did finally connect, it was with a kiss, nothing more, and it was totally unplanned. We were on tour, and as Narvel recalls, I was really nervous and confused. I was thinking, wait a minute, what happened? What's she thinking, and what's she going to be like tomorrow? But I want to say right now that Narvel Blackstock didn't break up my marriage, and I didn't break up his. Both marriages had been in trouble for a long time. His situation was equally sad, and the timing of our troubles was so regrettably and uncomfortably close, it was awkward. And for this reason, in fact, I made it a point to keep Narvel from finding out that I intended to leave Charlie for good. So when Bill Carter told Narvel that I had filed for divorce in Tulsa, he was dumbfounded. I had to tell Narvel straight out, this is what I want to do with my life, for myself. I didn't divorce Charlie because of you. I certainly didn't expect or want him to leave his wife for me. While some intense feelings had been ignited in us, if we were meant to get together, it would have to be a free choice, not some impossible rebound situation. And in the midst of my divorce, I could hardly imagine ever marrying again. Narvel wound up in divorce court himself 4 months later, in October of 1987. My own divorce was just about final, and there were folks who wanted to make something out of Narvel's timing. The truth is that once Narvel realized that he and Lisa weren't going to be able to work things out, he delayed filing for divorce as long as possible. He wanted to avoid giving the impression that our divorces were related, when in fact, both marriages had been dying for years. Their funerals just happened to come a few months apart. It took a full 9 months before Narvel and I decided that we truly wanted to become a couple. Looking back, I'm not sure there was any one thing that decided it. Our whole relationship had been a growth process. Narvel said, "We were both fighting for a goal, and anybody who really knew me, including my ex-wife, knew how hard I'd worked and how badly I wanted it. I think Reba was the only person who wanted it that bad. I think over a period of time, Reba changed. I changed. And we became real good business buddies. We never had any romantic involvement at all, but when it happened, it happened." Narvel and I had lots of fun together, like the time in Wisconsin when the whole group was going to have a retreat in Oshkosh in between dates. On the way to Oshkosh, Larry Jones, my driver, had an appendicitis attack. So as quickly as we could, we pulled over to the nearest town with a hospital and admitted Larry to the hospital. The next day, Narvel and I packed a picnic basket and rented a boat. We rowed across the lake. I was at one end of the boat, Narvel was at the other. I looked up, and his face was just covered with sweat. It was about 100 degrees that day, and the sweat was running into his eyes. I just about died laughing, and Narvel just about died of heat stroke. Some little romantic moment that was. But our romance did take off, and in May of 1988, we bought a condominium together. It was there that we celebrated our first Christmas together, just the two of us, before we set off for our respective families' homes in Texas and Oklahoma. The night we trimmed the tree was very special. We had a glass of wine, a fire, soft Christmas music, and we took turns opening our gifts. I couldn't wait to give Narvel my presents, but he insisted, "You go first." He handed me a big box. Inside it was an igloo ice chest, and at the bottom were a couple of telephone books. I was pretty confused until I saw the note that read, "This one isn't it. Go to the next one." Narvel opened my first gift to him, a cellular phone, and then it was my turn again. I got another large box and another note. We kept taking turns until finally I opened a box that had a smaller box inside. Within that one was a smaller box, then another and another. The smallest box held a beautiful Marquise diamond engagement ring. What a romantic way to propose. When this man wants to do a production, he does a production. By January of 1989, we were talking about buying some property. I wanted acreage and Narvel wanted by the water. Linda DeMith was my hairdresser at the time, and I figured hairdressers knew everyone, so I asked her about it. It only took her about half an hour to come up with a lead in Gallatin, a suburb of Nashville. Narvel and I drove out late that afternoon to see the place. Things didn't look promising, and then suddenly a 4-story red brick house rose up in front of us. It overlooked the Cumberland River and was surrounded by giant oaks. By the time we finished looking, we were in love with the place, and when our realtor told us we could get the 2 adjoining tracts of land, we were sold. There was a lot of remodeling needed, so we couldn't move in it for almost a year. But they gave us time to find furniture that we really liked. It was the one and only house Narvel and I looked at. When I saw the house finished, with its red bricks painted with the soft buttercup yellow we'd chosen, I cried. I just loved it. Around this time, I got the chance to live out one of my wildest dreams, to star in a movie. Of course, I'd been acting in my videos for 5 years and on a number of television specials, but this was my first shot at the big screen. Tremors was a science fiction horror film, only funny. It was pretty rough filming in the desert, but the movie had an interesting story and the cast was great. Besides Kevin Bacon and Fred Ward, it featured Finn Carter and Michael Gross, who played my husband. As Richard Schickel said in Time magazine, it's in the tradition of the 50s horror movies. Tremors is bound to become a classic. Not a bad way to launch a movie career. I don't know that Narvel and I really would have ever gotten married if I didn't have such a strong urge to have a baby. Up until then, I had reconciled myself that I would never have a child. That was because of Charlie. Charlie had his 2 boys from a previous marriage, and he wasn't about to make a place for kids in our life. "If you have children, you don't sing," Charlie had told me. "I'm not going to be stuck cleaning shitty diapers while you're off on the road." But my relationship with Narvel was so different, and I found myself longing to have a baby with him. And so finally, Narvel and I began to talk seriously about marriage. After my first week of shooting Tremors, he came out to meet me in Southern California. I toured on weekends throughout the shooting, and he planned to accompany me to our concert date. So while we were sitting in the Los Angeles airport, Narvel asked me, "What do you think about us getting married in Lake Tahoe?" I loved the idea. The week before the wedding, Mama flew out to be with me on the movie set. Then Mama and I drove into Lake Tahoe to meet Narvel, while our families arrived later that night, having flown into Reno. I had been booked to perform at Caesar's Palace, and they all came to watch the show. Then the next afternoon at 2 o'clock, we all boarded a bus and went to Zephyr's Cove, loaded onto a catamaran, and crossed the lake to Emerald Bay. Although it was the 3rd of June, it was so cold you would have thought it was the middle of November. I wore a simple white cotton long-sleeved summer dress. The sun came out as Narvel and I said our wedding vows on Lake Tahoe's beautiful Emerald Bay. If you ever get the chance, go see it. After I finished filming Tremors, we were off to Cancun, Mexico for our honeymoon. I'd always heard that you shouldn't drink the water south of the border, so we tried to be very careful with Narvel drinking Diet Coke and me drinking bottled water. But one night, we went out to a show, and we both had a margarita. Later that night, I started feeling real queasy, and I figured that the ice in the margarita was to blame. Even the thought of food made me ill, which was very unusual for me. I'm almost always hungry. When my stomach trouble persisted, we decided it would be best to cut our trip short and return back to the States. Back home in Nashville, I discovered that I wasn't suffering from Montezuma's revenge after all. I'll never forget my excitement when, sitting on the edge of the bathtub in our condominium, I saw the little white dot on the home pregnancy tester turn bright pink. I was pregnant deader'n a hammer. There was no doubt about it. And that afternoon, as we were flying out to do a show, I called Mama from a payphone at the Nashville airport to tell her I was pregnant. She was thrilled, of course, and so was Gloria, Narvel's mama. Both mothers agreed not to spread the news for a while so we could have the chance to tell all of our people personally. Also, I wanted to make sure everything was okay before we announced my pregnancy. I was 34 at the time. Later, I was shocked to see my picture on the 10 o'clock news and to hear the broadcaster say that I was going to have a baby. I didn't like the invasion of privacy, of course, but I mostly resented losing the chance to announce the upcoming birth of my first child myself. Still, the news leak was just a small cloud on our joy. I loved being pregnant, every bit of it. I continued to tour for the rest of 1989 and finished on December the 3rd in Orlando, Florida. When I got back to Nashville on December the 4th and went in for my regular prenatal exam, my doctor, Dr. John Van Hoydunk, told me my cervix had thinned considerably. Although my due date was March the 8th, more than 3 months away, I was already having minor contractions. Eventually, even with all my precautions, I was put into the hospital twice. After my second admission, they sent me home with a little syringe, activated by a pump I carried in my shirt pocket, which was attached to a tube that ran into my stomach. It would pump a small amount of medicine into my stomach to stop the contractions. Then, every 3 days, I had to go to the doctor's office where nurses would change the needle in my stomach. It was a painful ritual, but I would have hung by my toes from the ceiling if it had meant having a healthy child. Staying in bed all that time did have 2 positive effects. One, it gave me the chance to listen to my intuition, because I had been having that feeling again. I had to find a way to tell Jimmy Bowen, the president of my record label, with whom I'd had the biggest recording success of my career, that I wanted another producer. So I just came right out and told him, "I think we've been together long enough. I think I need to get someone different to produce me." "I agree with you 100%, he said, "and I'll work to find you another producer." That's all the discussion we had. It was that quick and that easy. I eventually chose Tony Brown, with whom I would record Rumor Has It in 1990, For My Broken Heart in 1991, It's Your Call in 1992, and The Greatest Hits Volume 2 in 1993. Each album has sold more than 2 million copies, and each continues to sell. The feeling had steered me right again. The second positive effect was that I had a lot of time on my hands to listen for great songs. That's also the time I met Linda Davis. On Thursday, February the 23rd, my water broke. As Narvel and I set out on the 35-mile trip to Nashville's West Side Hospital, I started getting really strong contractions. When we hit the interstate, Narvel was driving more than 100 miles per hour, talking on the car phone to my mama, his parents, and then his children. I was admitted to the hospital at 10 p.m. Then I was put into bed. I had my baby in that same bed, in the same room, and didn't leave it for 2 days. Dr. Van Hooydonk arrived and did an examination. "This is it," he said. "You're really pretty far along." Then he turned to Narvel and said, "Let's go have a Coke. It'll be at least 5 hours before the baby's born." Right before he left with Narvel, Dr. Van Hooydonk tapped my foot. "Hold off on the drugs as long as you can," he said. Just then another hard contraction hit me, and I'm not the least bit ashamed to report that I said, "Ladies, bring on the drugs," just as the door shut behind Dr. Van Hooydonk. I figure every woman has her own threshold for pain, and mine's pretty high. But this was no time to be a martyr. I wouldn't be ready to give birth until 4 a.m. Then the room was filled with nurses, and it was getting really serious. But the baby wouldn't come out. His shoulders were hung on my pelvis bone. Then exactly at 5:04 a.m. on Friday, February the 23rd, our son was born. I was overcome with joy and began praising and thanking God for my beautiful baby boy. I've seen my name in letters as tall as a house. I've won virtually every major award my career offers. I say all of that simply to say this: I've never been as fulfilled as I was when my son was born. We named him Shelby Stephen McIntyre Blackstock. Shelby, after Narvel's paternal grandpa. Shelby Herschel Blackstock. Stephen, after my paternal great-grandfather, Clark Stephen McIntyre. McIntyre after me, and Blackstock after Narvel. That's a mouthful for a little boy. Ever since the first moment of Shelby's life, I've hated to be separated from him. But as much as I enjoyed staying home for a while, I knew I'd have to go back to work pretty soon. I'd taken off December, January, February, and March. Then in April I recorded my first LP with Tony Brown, and we put the 1990 show together. We went back out on the road in May. Shelby was too tiny and fragile to come along then, so we found him a wonderful nanny, Cindy Bailey. I know Shelby's always been in good hands. I'd been pregnant during our last days of touring in 1989, and so the bus became too rough for me to travel on. We started flying. We loved it so much that after Shelby was born, we decided to sell my bus to Patty Loveless and continue flying. We've been flying ever since. In 1990, I was flying to all of my dates. I could leave for a show around 6 p.m. along with Sandy Spica, my hairdresser and designer, and Narvel, and be home by around 2 a.m. to spend the night in my own bed. I could be there when Shelby woke up in the morning and spend the day with him, instead of spending it in a hotel room somewhere or staring out the window of the bus as the miles between our jobs went by. The band continued for the majority of our dates to travel by bus, and since Narvel and I weren't traveling along with them anymore, the job of tour manager took on new importance. The tour manager was the one who had to keep it all together, and who had to handle any crisis with personnel, paraphernalia, or transportation that might arise along the way. Jim Hammond was the consummate pro. In 1988, when Narvel became my manager and the overseer of my entire organization, Jim took over as tour manager. From then on, he and Narvel had a kind of friendly competition, always trying to outthink each other on ways to improve the show. Perhaps more than anybody else in the organization, Jim lived rather than worked his job. He was a benevolent control freak. I felt totally secure as he led me on and off stage through the dark and twisting hallways that opened in front of thousands of people. Many times I'd walk to the back of the stage at the end of the show after the spotlight had blinded me, and from out of nowhere, Jim's hand would grab me right above the elbow, and he'd steer me safely through the noise, crowds, and confusion. A big part of Jim's job was supervising the musicians, but Jim managed to retain the musicians' goodwill while gaining their respect. I still can't believe what Sandy Spica, who is normally quiet and reserved in new situations, what she did to Jim on the second day she knew him. She had just joined the show, but she got up the nerve to play one of those inevitable road jokes on Jim. He was snoring on the couch in the middle of the day when she applied fuchsia nail polish to Jim's beefy fingernails. Sandy remembers that it wasn't until it was time to eat that Jim noticed his bright fingernails. She said he had the most confused look on his face. Jim looked like a grizzly, but he had the soft heart of a teddy bear. Let me introduce you to the other members of my musical family at that time, as we began touring after our Christmas break in early 1991. Kurt Capello was my band leader and musical director, a genius I had hired away from Barbara Mandrell in 1989. He could play his keyboard while directing the other players and the singers without missing anything else happening on stage. Kirk was a real individualist. When we toured, I liked to sightsee in the cities where we played, and usually the band would come with me, but not Kirk. Larry Jones used to say that trying to get Kirk to do things with me, his boss, was as hard as getting a teenager to do something with his parents. When I wanted to stop to see Niagara Falls, Kirk refused to get off the bus. And in Los Angeles, he snuck out halfway through the Universal Studios tour, but I didn't mind. One of my backup singers, Paula K. Evans, was just the opposite of Kirk. She was like a tourist at almost every stop, running around sightseeing and taking pictures. On one trip, she waded into snow that was as deep as she was tall. There were many times they'd get into a town real tired from the road, and everybody else would want to rest until showtime, but not Paula. No matter how many miles or hours she'd gone, Paula K. was ready for a sightseeing tour. Paula K. also loved to paint. I have 2 tiny watercolors that she gave me of vases and flowers, which I cherish. Guitarist Michael Thomas came to work for me after working with T. Graham Brown. He was simply one of the best guitar players around, an artist with as much stage presence as talent. Michael's wit was extremely dry, and naturally, his special target was often Jim Hammond. Now, Jim was a heavy eater himself, but he just hated having to wait for slowpokes when they would all stop to eat. Then came the night in Texas when Jim was the last to finish dinner and get back on the bus. "Where's Hammond? Where's Hammond?" the band was chanting. "He's still inside," Michael said without emotion, waiting on his deep-fried Shetland pony. My drummer, Tony Saputo, was one of the other joke masters in the band. Jennifer Bowler remembers a time when the bus broke down about an hour outside of Nashville. As everyone else sat fuming, waiting for its repair, Tony suddenly came bounding from the back of the bus, dressed as a mummy. He had wrapped himself in toilet paper from head to foot. Tony had a loving, almost childlike nature. Bass guitar player Terry Jackson, who had moved to Nashville with Tony, claimed that he liked touring because of his apartment. He had signed a 6-month lease on a place in a hip apartment complex overlooking the Cumberland River, wondering a little why no one else had grabbed it. Well, he soon learned that it was directly across the river from the city's sewage plant. He said the odor was so foul he could taste it. No wonder his rent was so cheap. He was one of the few black musicians in the country music business, and he was making a name for himself. He was great. Chris Austin was a new addition to the band, and he showed up for work on his first day carrying a Bible and his guitar. A veteran of the Ricky Skaggs Show, he was a born-again Christian who was also a talented secular and Christian songwriter. I hired him to sing harmony. His voice blended beautifully with Paula K's. Keyboard player Joey Saganaro was an innocent young man in that he hadn't been on the road all that long. He was truly a gentleman as well as a real professional. No matter how far we had to travel between restaurants or motels or show venues, no matter if we were playing in 100-degree heat or in Canada in January, he never complained. He was always on time and prepared to play. If all the players had been like Joey, I might not have needed a tour manager. The reason I'm going into so much detail about these 8 people, I'm sure you already know. We lost the Crazy Eight, as Garth Brooks called them, in March of 1991. Rounding out our band were Joe McGlohan and Pete Finney. Joe, my saxophone player, was one of the passengers on the second airplane, which landed safely in Nashville. After the crash, Joe took over the guidance of the band, and today is still my band leader. Pete Finney, who played steel guitar in the band, also flew on the second plane. As we began the early 1991 leg of the tour, our performance schedule was so heavy that sometimes we had to move our entire organization by plane. The week beginning March 11, 1991, we were booked into 4 different cities spread across the country over 6 days. We had a show in Saginaw, Michigan, then a private show for IBM in San Diego, then we had to make it to Fort Wayne, Indiana, and then to Evansville, Indiana. Finally, we'd fly back to San Diego for another private show. We'd been leasing our planes from Roger Woolsey. He leased us 2 small jet planes, a Sabreliner and a Hawker. For the Saginaw show, Narvel, Sandy, and I flew up and back home in the Sabreliner. Roger flew back to Saginaw to get the band and crew. The band and crew traveled to Saginaw by bus, but got on the planes to fly to San Diego. Narvel, Sandy, and I flew out that afternoon in the Hawker, and by the time we touched down in San Diego's Lindbergh Field, the band was already in town and getting ready for the show. Jim Hammond stood in the rain to meet us at the airport. As soon as Jim got into the limousine beside us, the talk turned to airplanes. "The Hawker is a little bigger than the Sabreliner," Jim said. "Do you all mind if we take the Hawker to Fort Wayne and you all take the Sabreliner when we fly back?" Well, that was fine with us. They needed the room more than we did. As we rode to the Harbor Island Sheraton Inn, where we would do our show and where Narvel, Sandy, and I would spend the night, Jim brought up another problem. "Well, we got a dilemma here," Jim said. "The show is at 9 o'clock. That means Reba's going to come off about 10:15. But there's an 11 o'clock curfew at the airport." So Narvel told Jim to have the pilots fly the Sabreliner and the Hawker over to nearby Brown Field. It had no curfew, and the band members could take their time getting to their planes after the concert. The band did not play on Sweet Dreams, my encore song. I always sang it a cappella. Instead, they went to their rooms to pack up, and thanks to the change in airports, many had time to call home and take showers before heading out. Narvel was watching television, and I was asleep when I was jolted awake by the ringing of a telephone. Who could that be at this time of night, I wondered. It was Roger Woolsey, our pilot. "Can you come to my room?" Roger asked Narvel. "I think something bad has happened." "I'll be right there," I heard my husband say as he hung up the phone. He dressed quickly while I asked questions he couldn't answer. I sat upright in bed. I wouldn't lie down again until the next night at my home in Tennessee. Later, Narvel would describe Roger as being white as a sheet when he walked into his room. "I watched everybody get on both planes," Roger said to Narvel. "Both planes taxied to the end of the runway, and I got into my car to come back to the hotel. I looked in my rearview mirror and I saw this huge ball of fire, and I don't know if it was them or not." Roger couldn't return to the airport that night because it was closed, since our planes had been the last 2 to take off that night. So when Narvel got to his room, he found Roger dialing madly to get information. Finally, Roger hung up the telephone and turned to Narvel. "Yes," he said, "a plane did go down." I remember that I was still sitting in the same position when Narvel came back. He told me what Roger had learned, and I asked, "Is everybody okay?" "No," Narvel said, "they're not. Reba, it's a possibility that everybody is dead." "Oh, Narvel, surely not," I said. I burst into tears. Narvel telephoned Mike Allen, who booked the date, and Sandy Spica, and asked them to come to our room. It was a while before we would receive confirmation that it was one of our planes that had gone down. And even then, there was no word about survivors. Through radio contact, the pilot of our aircraft, still in the air, had supplied his passenger list, so we could figure out who was on the fallen plane. It was now approaching 6 a.m. in Texas and Oklahoma, where Narvel's and my parents lived. We didn't want them to hear the news on television or the radio before we talked to them, so Narvel called his parents and I called mine. After I heard my daddy say hello, I lost it again. Like a dream, it all went through my mind. They'll never hear their daddy's voices again. "Hello, Daddy," I said. "This is Reba. I'm okay, but something terrible has happened." "Okay," he said. I could tell he'd been sound asleep. "We're in San Diego, and the band and crew flew out on 2 planes, and one of them went down, and we're pretty sure everyone's dead." That was the first time I'd heard myself say it. Narvel called 9 families, including his parents, during the next 2 hours. I would follow Narvel pacing from room to room in our suite, crying. But Narvel kept a level head, and he later said that staying busy kept him from breaking up. Many times that night I saw him silently hold a telephone while I heard someone screaming at the other end of the line. It was worse than any nightmare I could imagine. The cable news network and other channels were updating the reports. I called Barbara Mandrell in the hours after the incident because Kurt Capello, my musical director, had worked for her before he joined me, and I thought she should know. Barbara is also my closest girlfriend in the music business. I respect her a lot. Barbara had seen tragedy up close, barely surviving a 2-car collision that took a man's life. And so in this darkest hour of my life, I called her, because I wanted to talk to someone who knew the Lord as I did. I needed that strength. We cried and prayed over the long-distance telephone lines. By now the sun was up, and still there was no official confirmation. But aviation officials and rescue workers knew from their calculations what we knew in our hearts, that it was impossible for anyone to survive a headlong plane crash into the side of a mountain. It would not be until late in the morning that we finally got definite word. A lot of rumors and misinformation have been printed about the early morning events of March the 16th, 1991. What follows is, I hope, the most complete account yet that anyone has been able to construct of what happened that night. The twin-engine Hawker jet left San Diego at 1:41 a.m. The National Weather Service reported conditions as clear with a calm wind, roughly 3 minutes after departure, about 8 nautical miles from Brown Field. According to the National Transportation Safety Board report, released months after the tragedy, the crash occurred on the western slope of Otay Mountain, about 172 feet from the summit. It was clear that the pilot obviously had no idea that a killing peak lay in his path. There were no lights on the rural mountain. How could 2 such experienced pilots fly into the side of a mountain? Fans and family have asked me that question, but no more than I have asked it myself. The records of the medical examiner show that the autopsies of the pilot and co-pilot reveal no evidence of physical incapacitation or impairment that would have been causal to the accident. Instead, the National Transportation Safety Board reports a fatal series of mishaps leading up to the crash. First, before the pilot could take off, he had to file a flight plan based on instrument flight rules called IFR, meaning that he would be under the direct supervision and guidance of an air traffic controller. He called a flight service specialist at nearby Montgomery Field to file his plan, wondering how long it would take to go through and hoping he could avoid a long wait. During their conversation, it was suggested the pilot could take off whenever he wanted if he used visual flight rules, meaning he would not be guided by the tower, but instead would be responsible for knowing about and avoiding any obstacles in the terrain which were in his flight path, and then obtain his IFR clearance while in the air. The pilot elected to go that route, a decision not all that unusual for a private plane. Second, until the pilot came under the supervision of the tower, he would be forbidden to fly into San Diego's terminal control area called TCA. TCAs, in theory, make flying safer by separating faster aircraft like his jet from slower aircraft. So apparently trying to avoid entering into this TCA before he received clearance from the tower, the pilot radioed the flight service specialist twice more. According to the transcripts, the specialist confirmed that the pilot's proposed plan would put him into the TCA without clearance. The pilot then said, "So I would be better off if I headed right northeast and stayed down below 3,000 feet?" "Yeah, sure, that'll be fine," said the specialist. Later, Jim Miller, supervisor of the Federal Aviation Administration's effectiveness system, suggested that when the pilot mentioned 3,000 feet, he might have meant 3,000 feet above sea level, while the specialist apparently thought the pilot meant 3,000 feet altitude, which would have put him several hundred feet higher. The miscommunication would be deadly. Back at the hotel, we were packing to leave San Diego. There was nothing left for us to do there, and a tremendous amount of work lay ahead of us in Nashville. By noon, the hotel security personnel escorted us out of the building through a back way, and we were able to evade the press. Narvel and I were running on adrenaline when our plane touched down in Gallatin. We had been awake for many hours and had no idea when we would rest again. We drove straight home, and I took Shelby in my arms as soon as I got in. He had just turned 1. Holding his warm little body was such an affirmation of life, a comfort I really needed right then. Then Narvel and I went to see the families, starting with Jim's wife, Debbie Hammond. From Debbie's, we went to see Dana McVickers, Michael Thomas's wife. It was late when Narvel and I got back to our house. We went from home to home again the next day. By the time that long, terrible weekend was over, we were emotionally and physically exhausted. On Monday, March the 18th, my Starstruck Entertainment offices opened for the first time since the accident. The telephones were ringing as my people walked in at 9 a.m. The answering service was jammed with calls that had come into our office over the weekend. Our staff set to work, returning calls, fielding press requests, communicating with the coroner's office and the sheriff's department in San Diego, and talking with the families about funeral arrangements. Narvel and I decided that we would organize a memorial service in Nashville to honor all 8 of our friends as well as the 2 pilots. I am so proud of how tirelessly everyone worked for our loved ones. The word overtime was never mentioned. People in my office would be hurrying and planning one minute, and then someone would fall into tears the next. All of us pressed on. In the meantime, preparations for the memorial service were going on. We met with the police department, we met with the church staff. We talked about who would handle the music and who would handle the security. We arranged to release pictures of the deceased to the press. And then, Narvel and I wanted to find someone in the entertainment industry to speak at the service. I thought for a long time about who could relate to our tragedy, someone who had been through all kinds of rough times. Then it came to me, the man in black, Johnny Cash, who had virtually seen it all. I didn't know he had buried his mother a week before to the day, but God bless him, he said he'd do it. On Wednesday, March the 20th, shortly after noon, a convoy of 12 limousines carrying the families, Narvel and me, Narvel's parents, and my starstruck family, made the long journey to Christ Church in Brentwood. A crowd of about 2,000 people had gathered at the church. Reverend Dan Scott, one of the pastors at Christ Church, read from Psalms 91, my favorite chapter in the Bible. Then a 90-member choir raised their voices in song. When it was Johnny Cash's turn to speak, he sang "Jim, I Wore a Tie Today," about a musician attending another musician's funeral and inserting the names of the band members into the verses. He could not have chosen anything more appropriate or more uplifting. At the end of the service, Narvel and I walked to the limousine, and once inside, the dam finally broke. I think that keeping incredibly busy had been my mental leaning post for days. Now, for the first time, I could finally let those days' worth of suppressed emotion free. I cried most of the way back to my office. That helped. It released a lot of the stress and pressure. It was easier to meet with the families at the dinner we had planned for them. I probably had 24 requests for interviews within 48 hours of the crash. Jennifer Bowler, my publicist, turned them all down. But my silence didn't stop the flood of news stories. It was clear that I couldn't escape the press completely, so we decided to talk to Jane Sanderson, a reporter I trusted with People magazine. I appeared on the April 1st cover of People. It was such a private and painful period for me, but I had hoped that the interview would satisfy the public's need to know, and that I could retreat back into my life, and all of us, the families too, could begin the painful process of healing. After that, when I did do press interviews again, it was always with the stipulation that reporters not bring up the crash. I looked for solace in the place where I'd always found it before, in the Lord and in my music. A couple of days after the memorial service, I stunned the music community and myself by announcing that I would be returning to work. The question, inevitably, had come up even before we left San Diego. Mike Allen, our tour booking agent, didn't know what to do about our dates. I remember saying, "Cancel everything until July and we'll decide later." One of the dates was an appearance on March the 25th, 9 days after the crash, at the annual Academy Awards, the Oscars. The song I'd been scheduled to perform was "I'm Checking Out," which Meryl Streep had sung in Postcards from the Edge. "I'm checking out of this old heartbreak hotel," it went, and I tried to imagine myself singing it. I got to thinking that the heartbreak hotel was the world. That "we're checking out" was the band's way of saying, "We're not hurting, we're okay." And I just knew in my heart that if I could have discussed it with them, the band would have told me to go on and do it. It was a gut feeling, a sign of their approval. A peaceful feeling swept over me as I said, "Narvel, I'm going to do the Oscars." "Are you sure?" he said. Yes, I would do the show for the band. When I sang at the Oscars the following week, I think most of the audience knew what had happened to my band and Jim. The song took on new meaning for them like it had for me. I sang it with all my heart. Then after the Oscars, I went on the road. Needless to say, not everybody agreed with my decision. Some people accused me of being disrespectful, and others said I was hungry for money. I wouldn't have done anybody any good by laying around. There were many people depending on me, the surviving band members, my stage and production crew, many of whom had families to support. We had to put a band together in 1 week. That was barely enough time to meet, much less rehearse 6 musicians and a vocalist. Dolly Parton had called me at the office when she heard of the crash. She said if I needed anything to tell her. No wonder I've been a huge fan of hers from the beginning. I thanked her and asked her if we could use the services of Gary Smith, her band leader and record producer. He knew every good musician in Nashville. We asked him to form a band for us. No promises were made to the new musicians that they would have a job indefinitely. After what we'd been through, I don't think any of us could have made any promises. I rehearsed with the new group and immediately realized how much pressure was on them. They knew that some fans would compare them to the old band, and we all had to try to do the best job we could. It would be hard for all of us. I mentally prepared myself for that first show in Columbus, Ohio, and I was pulling for the band. Those guys held up like troopers, totally applying themselves to their playing and performing. At the end of 1991, Narvel and I had to consider what we were going to do about a band for 1992. My musical organization has a history of changing each year. It's common knowledge in Nashville that I and other entertainers add in some track players at the beginning of each year. I think that change helps maintain a band's freshness. We asked a number of the new band members to return with us in January. The others, 6 altogether, were given ample notice, along with our heartfelt appreciation for all they'd done for us. That was on December the 4th, 1991. As most Nashville entertainers hire their bands at the beginning of each year, we wanted these people to have plenty of time to find new employment. We also invited them to play my New Year's Eve show at double salary. All but one band member took a professional attitude. The disgruntled musician talked to a reporter, and a big story followed. It said that I had fired my band 2 weeks before Christmas, and suggested that I didn't care about the players or their families. It made no mention of my considerations. The story was a distortion and an embarrassment to me. It was an unfortunate end to a painful, difficult year. I had to wonder at the time if the fallout from the tragedy we had suffered would ever stop. But throughout this sad time, the outpouring from my fans was overwhelming. Please let me tell you how much I appreciated your kindness in helping me to get through it. I love each and every one of you for your love and support, as well as for your financial help to the victims' families. I'm very grateful to members of the country music community, too. And I owe a special expression of gratitude to C.K. Spurlock, Kenny Rogers' international promoter. C.K., who was very close to Michael Thomas, was the one who organized the benefit to provide financial help to the crash victims' families. In May of 1991, I went into the studio to record For My Broken Heart, the album that was my commemoration of the band and Jim. That album means the most to me of all the albums I've ever recorded. It clearly expresses my feelings of hurt and my hope for healing. The final song on the album is called If I'd Only Known, obviously dedicated to my band and Jim. There was so much of my heart in that song that it tore me up to sing it. I performed it once on an AIDS benefit television special, which seemed appropriate, and I sang it on the Oprah Winfrey Show, where some of the audience cried through the whole song. I was caught off guard on that show. Right after I was introduced, the first thing I was hit with was film footage of the crash, while the camera stayed on my face to register my reaction. I was shocked. But now I see that Oprah is a very wise woman. She recognized how, when you're a public figure, folks look to you for leadership. They want to see how you handle a tragedy that might be similar to one they once went through or might go through. But for a while I was too heartbroken to assume the role. Music is so weird sometimes, so therapeutic and healing. In 1992, when I went into the studio to record my new album, It's Your Call, the first song I chose was Lighter Shade of Blue. I had found it just before we left on that fateful trip to San Diego, and it had really moved me. Later it gave me hope in those dark days that my sorrow would eventually subside. When the new album came out, people would ask me if I was over the crash. I could only say, it's just like the song, I've only turned a lighter shade of blue. In the aftermath of the crash, we were touring a lot, but I found myself wishing for something different to do to get my mind off the accident. The answer to my prayer came from Ken Cragen, Kenny Rogers' manager. Kenny was making a 2-part television miniseries, The Gambler 4, The Gambler Returns, and he wanted me to be in it. I knew it would be a lot of fun to work with Kenny, and I've always been a huge fan of his. I got to play a madam back at the turn of the century. It was a western, so I rode horse and wore beautiful full dresses. My next role came in 1993, in the made-for-TV movie Man from Left Field, in which I co-starred with Burt Reynolds. Burt is not only a great actor, but he's also a great director. In one scene where Burt and I were lying in the sand, he had about 3 pages of dialogue to do. If I'd have thought about it, I would have wondered how in the world he could memorize all that. Suddenly I heard a tiny, muffled voice. "Where is that coming from?" I said to myself, but I stayed in character, as you're supposed to do until someone yells cut. Finally I noticed a wire running from inside Bert's shirt to an earpiece. Someone off camera was feeding him his lines. I thought that was clever, and had I known that could be done, I might have asked for the assistance myself. That same spring, I got the part of Ma Tex in the movie North, which had a cast accomplished enough to intimidate any fairly green actor. Bruce Willis, Dan Aykroyd, and Kathy Bates. I learned a lot by watching them work. It was produced and directed by Rob Reiner, who treated me as nicely as I could have ever asked for. And in 1994, I'm releasing my own made-for-TV movie based on my video Is There Life Out There? It's the story of a woman who's made a good life, marriage, children, a home, but she can't help but wonder if she's missing out on something, The video ends with the woman, me, receiving a college diploma and a chance to make her good life better. Nothing I've ever done has touched so many women's hearts. I can't count the number of letters I've gotten from women who said they went back to school after watching the video. I've had a good life myself, and it makes me feel good to give something back, not only through music, but also through social involvement. One way I'm doing it is through the Reba Ranch House. It's connected to the Texoma Medical Center in Denison, Texas, about 60 miles from where I grew up. It's a home away from home for families whose loved ones are hospitalized at the center, so they can be nearby to care and comfort them. It's a project I'm very proud of. Since we first started out, Starstruck Entertainment has been expanding to include 3 music publishing companies, a publicity agency, a concert booking and promotions agency, a construction company, a racing stable, a jet service company, my fan club, an advertising company, and an artist management company that includes 4 managers and their assistants. We all have experiences that seem designed to keep us humble. Once I was invited to the White House by President George Bush. When Narvel, Shelby, and I were escorted into the President's chambers, we stood in awe. But Shelby, less than a year old, grabbed the President's finger and started slobbering on it. I apologized, but he told me not to worry about it. He was used to that from his grandchildren. Mrs. Bush was very welcoming and gracious, and even showed us where they lived and the rooms where other presidents had slept. I stood in one of the rooms that Jackie Kennedy had redecorated, and in the Lincoln room where Michael Jackson had stood at the window and waved to a fan. A girl who never had her own room as a child walked among the private chambers of the most powerful men in history. Still, meeting some of these famous folks hasn't impressed me as much as meeting some of my everyday fans. So many of them have followed my career from the very beginning, and I appreciate their loyalty tremendously. No one could be more loving than my fans. They put groceries on my table, and I hope I've brought half as much joy to their lives as they have brought to me. I thank the Lord daily for Shelby and for putting Narvel and me together so we could have him. Family unity is priceless, so I want Shelby to be with me a lot, and I often take him along on personal appearance tours. He and I might go swimming or just play during the day, and then I leave him with Michelle Nunn, his new nanny that replaced Cindy Bailey when she got married in 1993, while I do my show. Sometimes he goes to my after-show visit with members of my fan club. At my annual fan club party in June of 1993, Shelby came on stage with me. He looked the crowd right in the eye, and he talked to me and he talked to them. I know it thrilled him to be in front of an audience. He already has quite a bit of showbiz in him. In October of that same year, I was playing Las Vegas, and Shelby flew out with Cindy Bailey, who was then his nanny. On the second night, he asked if he could go to my show with me. "Shelby, you want to come out on the stage tonight and bring me a towel, because I sure do get sweaty." "Yeah, Mama, I do that," he said. So I told Graham Lagdon, my tour manager. Now, when I say I've been worried about how to introduce Shelby into the workplace, especially since this is the music business, send him out. So Shelby came out right on cue, carrying a towel. Instead of bringing me a rose or something, he was bringing me something that meant he was really working. The crowd just loved it. I played Phoenix the next night and asked Shelby if he'd like to repeat his performance. "No, Mom," he said, "I'm too tired of that. Let Guam do it." I have a million cute stories about him, just like any mother has. One has to do with Shelby's potty training and the honesty of a child. Shelby learned to use the bathroom by coming to me and saying, "Pee-pee, Mama, pee-pee." We'd run to the bathroom and Shelby'd do his business, and I'd say, "Good boy, Shelby, good boy." One day when we were on a vacation in 1992, Narvel, Shelby, and I were in the bathroom getting ready to go out to eat. Shelby still carries a security blanket and was carrying it inside the bathroom with Narvel and me. When Narvel stepped over to the toilet to use the restroom, Shelby walked over to him, took his blankie out of his mouth, and said, "Good boy, Day, good boy." That was one for the baby book. My son's childhood obviously won't have anything in common with my own. People ask me if I'm afraid Shelby will be spoiled, and I tell folks I know he's already spoiled. But so am I. Not many people live the way I grew up, and not many people live the way I do now. I've always believed that children need and want discipline. Shelby's nannies have always had permission to discipline him if they needed to. I expect him to behave himself and to have good manners, and he does. Narvel and I have made it a practice to teach Shelby to look grown-ups in the eye when he talks to them, and to call them ma'am and sir. He's only 4, but he's definitely old enough to say please and thank you. Some of my friends have been very complimentary of Shelby's behavior, and I appreciate their kind words. Another important source of my happiness is the fact that my parents have long since escaped the poverty that afflicted their lives when us kids were young. They bought a new place 4 years ago. There's a window in the living room, and you can see in 3 directions for miles. Everything visible belongs to them. Maybe it's getting older and settled in life that has helped me recognize these things, but in some ways, I'm sure, the tragedy of March 16, 1991 has helped bring it home to me how fragile life is. No matter what happens to you, if you can draw strength from God and the people you love, nothing can ever defeat you. I remember flying home alone for the first time on our new airplane in June of 1991, not long after the crash, to return to Nashville. Before I got on, I walked up to the plane, and I asked God to bless it. "Now, Kevin," I said to Kevin McCutcheon, my pilot, "let's agree right now in the name of Jesus that everybody who steps on this plane is protected, and that it will fly safely and swiftly." He agreed. In early November of 1992, Narvel, Sandy, and I boarded a flight to Madison, Wisconsin, where our opening act, Brooks and Dunn, was getting ready to go on stage. By then, I knew the sound of the plane's landing gear returning to place after takeoff. On that night, I suddenly realized I wasn't hearing what I was supposed to hear. "Something's wrong," I said to Narvel. "Yeah," he said. About that time, Kevin looked through the curtain and motioned to Narvel to come to the cockpit. When Narvel came back, he confirmed what we had feared. "The landing gear didn't go up," he said, "and it won't go down. It's jammed." Then Kevin's voice came over the intercom. "We're going to fly around for a while to burn off more fuel. That way, if we make an emergency landing, we won't have much fuel on board." We cruised for about 45 minutes. During that time, to get our minds off what could happen, Sandy and I played cards and talked. Meanwhile, Kevin was talking to the Nashville tower and working constantly with the controls. Then he said, "We're going to make an emergency landing." On our first approach, I saw fire trucks on the side of the runway, waiting, just like in the movies. I hadn't been scared until then, but then I felt my eyes fill with tears. I honestly didn't panic, and I remember thinking, if it's my time, it's my time. And then we heard Kevin again. He said, "We're going to land on the 2 back wheels, slow down as much as possible, and then come down on the nose and belly of the plane. It's going to be loud, there will be metal against concrete, and we should have a few sparks." Now, the plane was probably going about 200 miles an hour when the weight of the fuselage settled onto the runway. Its scraping lasted for what seemed like an eternity, and it was definitely loud. Vice President-elect Al Gore was scheduled to arrive at the airport minutes after our forced landing, so the place was crawling with news cameramen who wound up filming us. The videotape made the plane look like a drag racing car with wings that were sweating fire. The instant the plane shrieked to a halt, Narvel, Sandy, and I jumped up from our seats. Once on the ground, we were surrounded by men wearing what looked like spacesuits and holding hoses. They sprayed the plane down with white foam. From the air, Kevin had ordered the preparation of another plane. We got right on it. People have asked me if I hesitated to board an airplane after getting off the one that had emergency landed. I didn't. "Well, if you have a car wreck, you get right into an ambulance," I told one interviewer. Our plane touched down in Madison, and we took the limousine to the back of the concert hall, as we had done 100 times before. And then I went out and did my show. And afterwards I did what I've done so many times before, and what I'll do indefinitely. I got back on my airplane. I flew home so I could fly out the next day, to the next show, on the way to the rest of my life.
Reba, My Story was written by Reba McEntire with Tom Carter and read by Reba McEntire. It was abridged for audio by Sophia Marchand. The recording engineer was Richard Barrow of Starstruck Entertainment, with editing by Stephen Strassman. The mix engineer was Karen Perlman. The associate producer was Linda Wallman. Reba, My Story was produced and directed by Elisa Shokoff. This has been a presentation of Simon & Schuster Audio.